with suppressed vexation. Upon some occasions, this scene would be repeated several times, till at last Captain Claret, thinking that in the eyes of all hands his dignity must by this time be pretty well bolstered, would stalk towards his subordinate, looking him full in the eyes, whereupon up goes his hand to the cap front, and the captain, nodding his acceptance of the report, descends from his perch to the quarter-deck. By this time, the stately Commodore slowly emerges from his cabin, and soon stands leaning alone against the brass rails of the after hatchway. In passing him, the captain makes a profound salutation, which his superior returns in token that the captain is at perfect liberty to proceed with the ceremonies of the hour. Marching on, Captain Claret at last halts near the main mast, at the head of a group of the wardroom officers, and by the side of the chaplain. At a sign from his finger, the brass band strikes up the Portuguese hymn. This over, from Commodore to hammock boy, all hands uncover, and the chaplain reads a prayer. Upon its conclusion, the drum beats the retreat, and the ship's company disappears from the guns. At sea or in harbor, this ceremony is repeated every morning and evening. By those stationed on the quarterdeck, the chaplain is distinctly heard, but the quarterdeck gun division embraces but a 10th part of the ship's company, many of whom are below, on the main deck, where not one syllable of the prayer can be heard. This seemed a great misfortune, for I well knew myself how blessed and soothing it was to mingle twice every day in these peaceful devotions, and, with the Commodore and Captain and smallest boy, unite in acknowledging Almighty God. There was also a touch of the temporary equality of the church about it, exceedingly grateful to a man-of-war's man like me. My carronade gun happened to be directly opposite the brass railing against which the Commodore invariably leaned at prayers, brought so close together twice every day for more than a year, we could not but become intimately acquainted with each other's faces. To this fortunate circumstance it is to be ascribed that some time after reaching home, we were able to recognize each other when we chanced to meet in Washington at a ball given by the Russian minister, the Baron de Boresco. And though while on board the frigate the Commodore never in any manner personally addressed me, nor did I him, yet at the minister's social entertainment, we there became exceedingly chatty. Nor did I fail to observe, among that crowd of foreign dignitaries and magnates from all parts of America, that my worthy friend did not appear so exalted as when leaning in solitary state against the brass railing of the Neversink's quarter-deck. Like many other gentlemen, he appeared to the best advantage and was treated with the most deference in the bosom of his home, the frigate. Our morning and evening quarters were agreeably diversified for some weeks by a little circumstance, which to some of us at least always seemed very pleasing. At Callao, half of the Commodore's cabin had been hospitably yielded to the family of a certain aristocratic-looking magnate who was going ambassador from Peru to the court of the Brazils at Rio. This dignified diplomatist sported a long, twirling mustache that almost enveloped his mouth. The sailors said he looked like a rat with his teeth through a bunch of oakum, or a St. Jago monkey peeping through a prickly pear bush. He was accompanied by a very beautiful wife and a still more beautiful little daughter about 6 years old. Between this dark-eyed little gypsy and our chaplain, there soon sprung up a cordial love and good feeling, so much so that they were seldom apart, and whenever the drum beat to quarters and the sailors were hurrying to their stations, this little señorita would outrun them all to gain her own quarters at the capstan, where she would stand by the chaplain's side, grasping his hand and looking up archly at his face. It was a sweet relief from the domineering sternness of our martial discipline, a sternness not relaxed even at our devotions before the altar of the common God of Commodore and cabin boy, to see that lovely little girl standing among the 32-pounders, and now and then casting a wondering, commiserating glance at the array of grim seamen around her. Chapter 70. Monthly muster round the capstan. Besides general quarters and the regular morning and evening quarters for prayers on board the Neversink, on the first Sunday of every month we had a grand muster round the capstan, when we passed in solemn review before the captain and officers, who closely scanned our frocks and trousers to see whether they were according to the navy cut. In some ships every man is required to bring his bag and hammock along for inspection. This ceremony acquires its chief solemnity, and to a novice is rendered even terrible, by the reading of the Articles of War by the captain's clerk before the assembled ship's company, who in testimony of their enforced reverence for the code stand bareheaded till the last sentence is pronounced. To a mere amateur reader, the quiet perusal of these Articles of War would be attended with some nervous emotions. Imagine then what my feelings must have been when with my hat deferentially in my hand I stood before my lord and master, Captain Claret, and heard these articles read as the law and gospel, the infallible, unappealable dispensation and code, whereby I lived and moved and had my being on board of the United States ship Neversink. Of some 20 offenses made penal that a seaman may commit, and which are specified in this code, 13 are punishable by death. Shall suffer by death. This was the burden of nearly every article read by the captain's clerk, for he seemed to have been instructed to omit the longer articles, and only present those which were brief and to the point. Shall suffer death. The repeated announcement falls on your ear like the intermitting discharge of artillery. After it has been repeated again and again, you listen to the reader as he deliberately begins a new paragraph. You hear him reciting the involved but comprehensive and clear arrangement of the sentence, detailing all possible particulars of the offense described, and you breathlessly await whether that clause also is going to be concluded by the discharge of the terrible minute gun. When lo, it again booms on your ear, shall suffer death. No reservations, no contingencies, not the remotest promise of pardon or retrieve, not a glimpse of commutation of the sentence. All hope and consolation is shut out. Shall suffer death. That is the simple fact for you to digest. And it is a tougher morsel, believe White Jacket when he says it, than a 42-pound cannonball. But there is a glimmering of an alternative to the sailor who infringes these articles. Some of them thus terminates, shall suffer death, or such punishment as a court-martial shall adjudge. But hence this at a penalty still more serious? Perhaps it means death or worse punishment. Your honors of the Spanish Inquisition, Loyola and Torquemada, produce, reverend gentlemen, your most secret code, and match these articles of war if you can. Jack Ketch, you also are experienced in these things. Thou most benevolent of mortals, who standest by us, and hangest round our necks, when all the rest of this world are against us, tell us, hangman, what punishment is this, horribly hinted at as being worse than death? Is it upon an empty stomach to read the articles of war every morning for the term of one's natural life? Or is it to be imprisoned in a cell with its walls papered from floor to ceiling with printed copies in italics of these articles of war? But it needs not to dilate upon the pure bubbling milk of human kindness and Christian charity, and forgiveness of injuries which pervade this charming document so thoroughly imbued as a Christian code with the benignant spirit of the Sermon of the Mount. But as it is very nearly alike in the foremost states of Christendom, and as it is nationally set forth by those states, it indirectly becomes an index to the true condition of the present civilization of the world. As month after month I would stand bareheaded among my shipmates and hear this document read, I have thought to myself, well, White Jacket, you're in a sad box indeed. But prick your ears, there goes another minute gun. It admonishes you to take all bad usage in good part, and never to join any public meeting that may be held on the gun deck for a redress of grievances. Listen. Article 13. If a person in the Navy shall make or attempt to make any mutinous assembly, he shall, on conviction thereof by a court-martial, suffer death. Bless me, White Jacket, you're a great gun yourself, that you so recoil to the extremity of your breechings at a discharge. But give ear again, here goes another minute gun. It indirectly admonishes you to receive the grossest insult, and stand still under it. Article 14. No private in the Navy shall disobey the lawful orders of his superior officer, or strike him, or draw, or offer to draw, or raise any weapon against him, while in the execution of the duties of his office, on pain of death. Do not hang back there by the bulwarks, White Jacket. Come up to the mark once more, for here goes still another minute gun, which admonishes you never to be caught napping. Part of Article 20. If any person in the Navy shall sleep upon his watch, he shall suffer death. Murderous! But then, in time of peace, do they not enforce these bloodthirsty laws? Do they not indeed? What happened to those 3 sailors on board an American armed vessel a few years ago, quite within your memory, White Jacket? Yeah, while you yourself were yet serving on board this very frigate, the Neversink. What happened to those 3 Americans, White Jacket? Those 3 sailors, even as you, who once were alive but now are dead, shall suffer death. Those were the 3 words that hung those 3 sailors. Have a care, then, have a care, lest you come to a sad end, even the end of a rope. Lest with a black and blue throat you turn a dumb diver after pearl shells, put to bed forever and tucked in your own hammock at the bottom of the sea. And there you will lie, White Jacket, while hostile navies are playing cannonball billiards over your grave. By the mainmast, then, in a time of profound peace, I am subject to the cutthroat martial law, and when my own brother, who happens to be dwelling ashore, and does not serve his country as I am now doing, when he is at liberty to call personally upon the President of the United States and express his disapprobation of the whole national administration, here am I, liable at any time to be run up at the yardarm with a necklace, made by no jeweler round my neck. A hard case truly, White Jacket, but it cannot be helped. Yes, you live under the same martial law. Does not everything around you den the fact in your ears? Twice every day do you not jump at your quarters at the sound of the drum? Every morning in port are you not roused from your hammock by the reveille, and sent to it again at nightfall by the tattoo? Every Sunday are you not commanded in the mere matter of this very dress you shall wear through that blessed day? Can your shipmates so much as drink their tot of grog? Nay, can they even drink but a cup of water at the scuttlebutt without an armed sentry standing over them? Does not every officer wear a sword instead of a cane? You live and move among 24-pounders, White Jacket. The very cannonballs are deemed an ornament around you, serving to embellish the hatchways, and should you come to die at sea, White Jacket, still 2 cannonballs would bear you company when you would be committed to the deep. Yeah, by all methods and devices and inventions, you are momentarily admonished of the fact that you live under the Articles of War, and by virtue of them it is, White Jacket, that without a hearing and without a trial you may, at a wink from the captain, be condemned to the scourge. Speak you true, then let me fly. Nay, White Jacket, the landless horizon hoops you in. Some tempest then, surge all the sea against us, hidden reefs and rocks, arise and dash the ship to chips. I was not born a serf, and will not live a slave. Quick, corkscrew whirlpools, suck us down, world's end whelm us. Nay, White Jacket, though this frigate laid her broken bones upon the Antarctic shore of Palmer's Land, though not 2 planks adhered, though all her guns were spiked by swordfish blades, and her yawning hatchways mouthed yawning sharks swam in and out, yet, should you escape the wreck and scramble to the beach, this martial law would meet you still and snatch you by the throat. Hark! Article 42, part of Section 3. In all cases where the crews of the ships or vessels of the United States shall be separated from their vessels by the latter being wrecked, lost, or destroyed, all the command, power, and authority given to the officers of such ships or vessels shall remain, and be in full force as effectually as if such ship or vessels were not so wrecked, lost, or destroyed. Hear you that, White Jacket? I tell you there is no escape. Afloat or wrecked, the martial law relaxes not its grip. And though by that self-same warrant for some offense therein set down you were indeed to suffer death, even then the martial law might hunt you straight through the other world and out again at its other end, following you through all eternity, like an endless thread on the inevitable track of its own point, passing unnumbered needles through. Chapter 71. The Genealogy of the Articles of War. As the Articles of War form the ark and constitution of the penal laws of the American Navy, in all sobriety and earnestness, it may be well to glance at their origin. Whence came they? And how is it that one arm of the national defenses of a republic comes to be ruled by a Turkish code, whose every section, almost like each of the tubes of a revolving pistol, fires nothing short of a death into the heart of an offender? How comes it that by virtue of a law solemnly ratified by a Congress of freemen, the representatives of freemen, thousands of Americans are subjected to the most despotic usages, and, from the dockyards of the Republic, absolute monarchies are launched, with the glorious stars and stripes for an ensign? By what unparalleled anomaly, by what monstrous grafting of tyranny upon freedom did these Articles of War ever come to be so much as heard of in the American Navy? Whence came they? They cannot be the indigenous growth of those political institutions which are based upon that arch-democrat Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. No, they are an importation from abroad, even from Britain, whose laws we Americans hurled off as tyrannical, and yet retained the most tyrannical of all. But we stop not here, for these Articles of War had their congenial origin in a period of the history of Britain when the Puritan Republic had yielded to a monarchy restored, when a hangman judge, Jeffreys, sentenced a world's champion like Algren and Sidney to the block, when one of a race by some deemed accursed of God, even a Stuart, was on the throne, and a Stuart also was at the head of the Navy, as Lord High Admiral. One, the son of a king, beheaded for encroachments upon the rights of his people, and the other, his own brother, afterward a king, James II, who was hurled from the throne for his tyranny. This is the origin of the Articles of War, and it carries with it an unmistakable clue to their despotism. Footnote 4. The first naval articles of war in an English language were passed in the 13th year of the reign of Charles II, under the title of An Act for Establishing Articles and Orders for the Regulating and Better Government of His Majesty's Navies, Ships of War, and Forces by Sea. This act was repealed, and so far as concerned the officers, a modification of it substituted in the 22nd year of the reign of George II, shortly after the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, just 1 century ago. This last act, it is believed, comprises in substance the Articles of War at this day in force in the British Navy. It is not a little curious, nor without meaning, that neither of these acts explicitly empowers an officer to inflict the lash. It would almost seem as if, in this case, the British lawgivers were willing to leave such a stigma out of an organic statute, and bestow the power of the lash in some less solemn, and perhaps less public manner. Indeed, the only broad enactments directly sanctioning naval scourging at sea are to be found in the United States Statute Book and in the sea laws of the absolute monarch, Louis le Grand of France. Taking for their basis the above-mentioned British naval law, and engrafting upon it the positive scourging laws, which Britain was loth to recognize as organic statutes, our American lawgivers in the year 1800 framed the Articles of War now governing the American Navy. They may be found in the second volume of the United States Statutes at Large, under Chapter 33, an Act for the Better Government of the Navy of the United States. For reference to the latter, Lord de la Marine, Vida Curtis's Treatise on the Rights and Duties of Merchant Seamen according to the General Maritime Law, Part 2, Chapter 1. Nor is it a dumb thing that the men who in democratic Cromwell's time first proved to the nations the toughness of the British oak and the hardihood of the British sailor, that in Cromwell's time whose fleet struck terror into the cruisers of France, Spain, Portugal, and Holland, and the corsairs of Algiers and the Levant. In Cromwell's time when Robert Blake swept the narrow seas of all the keels of a Dutch admiral who insultingly carried a broom at his foremast, it is not a dumb thing that at a period deemed so glorious to the British Navy, these Articles of War were unknown. Nevertheless, it is granted that some laws or some others must have governed Blake's sailors at that period, and they must have been far less severe than those laid down in the written code which superseded them, since, according to the father-in-law of James II, the historian of the rebellion, the English Navy, prior to the enforcement of the new code, was full of officers and sailors who, of all men, were the most republican. Moreover, the same author informs us that the first work undertaken by his respected son-in-law, then Duke of York, upon entering on the duties of Lord High Admiral, was to have a grand rechristening of the men of war, which still carried on their sterns names too democratic to suit his high Tory ears. But if these Articles of War were unknown in Blake's time, and also during the most brilliant period of Admiral Benbow's career, what inference must follow that such tyrannical ordinances are not indispensable, even during war, to the highest possible efficiency of a military marine? Chapter 72. Herein are the good ordinances of the sea, which wise men who voyaged round the world gave to our ancestors, and which constitute the books of the science of good customs, the consulate of the sea. The present usages of the American Navy are such that though there is no government enactment to that effect, yet in many respects its commanders seem virtually invested with the power to observe or violate, as seems to them fit, several of the Articles of War. According to Article 15, no person in the Navy shall quarrel with any other person in the Navy, nor use provoking or reproachful words, gestures, or menaces, on pain of such punishment as a court-martial shall adjudge. Provoking or reproachful words. Officers of the Navy, answer me. Have you not, many of you, 1,000 times violated this law and addressed to men whose tongues were tied by this very article language which no landsman would ever hearken to without flying at the throat of his insulter? I know that worse words than you ever used are to be heard and addressed by a merchant captain to his crew, but the merchant captain does not live under this Article 15th of war. Not to make an example of him, nor to gratify any personal feeling, but to furnish one certain illustration of what is here asserted, I honestly declare that Captain Claret of the Neversink repeatedly violated this law in his own proper person. According to Article 3, no officer or other person in the Navy shall be guilty of oppression, fraud, profane swearing, drunkenness, or any other scandalous conduct. Again, let me ask you, officers of the Navy, whether many of you have not repeatedly, and in more than one particular, violated this law. And here again, as a certain illustration, I must once more cite Captain Claret as an offender, especially in the matter of profane swearing. I must also cite 4 of the lieutenants, some 8 of the midshipmen, and nearly all the seamen. Additional articles might be quoted that are habitually violated by the officers, while nearly all those exclusively referring to the sailors are unscrupulously enforced. Yet those articles by which the sailor is scourged at the gangway are not one whit more laws than those articles binding upon the officers that have become obsolete from immemorial disuse, while still other articles to which the sailors alone are obnoxious are observed or violated at the caprice of the captain. Now, if it be not so much the severity as the certainty of punishment that deters from transgression, how fatal to all proper reverence for the enactments of Congress must be this disregard of its statutes. Still more, this violation of the law on the part of the officers in many cases involves oppression to the sailor. But throughout the whole naval code, which so hems in the mariner by law upon law, and which invests the captain with so much judicial and administrative authority over him, in most cases entirely discretionary, not one solitary clause is to be found which in any way provides means for a seaman deeming himself aggrieved to obtain redress. Indeed, both the written and unwritten laws of the American Navy are as destitute of individual guarantees to the mass of seamen as the statute book of the despotic empire of Russia. Who put this great gulf between the American captain and the American sailor? Or is the captain a creature of like passions with ourselves? Or is he an infallible archangel, incapable of the shadow of error? Or has a sailor no mark of humanity, no attribute of manhood, that bound hand and foot he is cast into an American frigate, shorn of all rights and defenses, while the notorious lawlessness of the commander has passed into a proverb, familiar to man-of-war's men, the law was not made for the captain? Indeed, he may almost be said to put off the citizen when he touches his quarter-deck, and almost exempt from the law of the land himself, he comes down upon others with a judicial severity unknown to the national soil. With the Articles of War in one hand and the cat-o'-nine-tails in the other, he stands in undignified parody upon Muhammad enforcing Muslimism with the sword and the Quran. The concluding sections of the Articles of War treat of the Naval Courts, martial, before which officers are tried for serious offenses as well as the seamen. The oath administered to members of these courts, which sometimes sit upon matters of life and death, explicitly enjoins that the members shall not at any time divulge the vote or opinion of any popular member of the court, unless required to do so before a court of justice in due course of law. Here then is a council of 10 and a star chamber indeed. Remember also that though the sailor is sometimes tried for his life before a tribunal like this, in no case do his fellow sailors, his peers, form part of the court. Yet that a man should be tried by his peers is the fundamental principle of all civilized jurisprudence. And not only tried by his peers, but his peers must be unanimous to render a verdict, whereas in a court-martial, the concurrence of a majority of conventional and social superiors is all that is requisite. In the English Navy, it is said they had a law which authorized the sailor to appeal, if he chose, from the decision of the captain, even in a comparatively trivial case, to the higher tribunal of the court-martial. It was an English seaman who related this to me, when I said that such a law must be a fatal clog to the exercise of the penal power in the captain. He, in substance, told me the following story. A topman, guilty of drunkenness, being sent to the gratings, and the scourge about to be inflicted, he turned round and demanded a court-martial. The captain smiled and ordered him to be taken down and put into the brig, where he was kept in irons some weeks. When despairing of being liberated, he offered to compromise at 24 lashes. "Sick of your bargain, then, are you?" said the captain. No, a court-martial you demanded, and a court-martial you shall have." Being at last tried before the bar of quarter-deck officers, he was condemned to 200 lashes. What for? For his having been drunk? No, for his having had the insolence to appeal from an authority, in maintaining which the men who tried and condemned him had so strong a sympathetic interest. Whenever this story be wholly true or not, or whether the particular law involved prevails, or if ever it did prevail in the English Navy, the thing nevertheless illustrates the ideas that man-of-war's men themselves have touching the tribunals in questions. What can be expected from a court whose deeds are done in the darkness of the recluse courts of the Spanish Inquisition? when that darkness is solemnized by the oath on the Bible, when an oligarchy of epaulets sits upon the bench, and a plebeian topman without a jury stands judiciously naked at the bar. In view of these things, and especially in view of the fact that, in several cases, the degree of punishment inflicted upon a man-of-war's man is absolutely left at the discretion of the court, what shame should American legislators take to themselves with that perfect truth we may apply to the entire body of the American man-of-war's men, that infallible principle of Sir Edward Coke? It is one of the genuine marks of servitude to have the law either concealed or precarious, but still better may we subscribe to the saying of Sir Matthew Hale in the History of the Common Law, that the martial law, being based upon no settled principles, is in truth and reality no law, but something indulged rather than allowed as a law. I know it may be said that the whole nature of this naval code is purposely adapted to the war exigencies of the Navy, but waiving the grave question that might be raised concerning the moral, not judicial lawfulness of this arbitrary code, even in time of war, be it asked why it is enforced during a time of peace. The United States has now existed as a nation upward of 70 years, and in all that time the alleged necessity of the operation of the naval code, in cases deemed capital, has only existed during a period of 2 or 3 years at most. Some may urge that the severest operations of the code are tacitly made null in time of peace. But though with respect to several of the articles this holds true, yet at any time any and all of them may be legally enforced. Nor have there been wanting recent instances illustrating the spirit of this code, even in cases where the letter of the code was not altogether observed. The well-known case of a United States brig furnishes a memorable example, which at any moment may be repeated. 3 men in a time of peace were then hung at the yardarm, merely because in the captain's judgment it became necessary to hang them. To this day, the question of their complete guilt is socially discussed. How shall we characterize such a deed, says Blackstone, if any one hath commission to martial authority doth, in time of peace, hang or otherwise execute any men by color of martial law? This is murder, for it is against Magna Carta. Commentaries B1, Chapter 13. Magna Carta, we moderns, who may be landsmen, may justly boast of civil immunities not possessed by our forefathers, but our remoter forefathers, who happen to be mariners, may straighten themselves even in their ashes to think that their lawgivers were wiser and more humane in their generation than our lawgivers in ours. Compare the sea laws of our navy with the Roman and Rhodian ocean ordinances. Compare them with the consulate of the sea. Compare them with the laws of the Hansa towns. Compare them with the ancient Wisbury laws. In the last we find that they were ocean democrats in those days. If he strikes, he ought to receive blow for blow. Thus speak out the Wisbury laws concerning a Gothland sea captain. In final reference to all that has been said in previous chapters touching the severity and unusualness of the laws of the American Navy, and by large the authority vested in its commanding officers, be it here observed that Whitejacket is not unaware of the fact that the responsibility of an officer commanding at sea, whether in the merchant service or the national marine, is unparalleled by that of any other relation in which man may stand to man. Nor is he unmindful that both wisdom and humanity dictate that from the peculiarity of his position, a sea officer in command should be clothed with a degree of authority and discretion inadmissible in any master ashore. But at the same time, these principles, recognized by all writers on maritime law, have undoubtedly furnished warrant for clothing modern sea commanders and naval court-martials with powers which exceed the due limits of reason and necessity. Nor is this the only instance where right and salutary principles, in themselves almost self-evident and infallible, have been advanced in justification of things, which in themselves are just as self-evidently wrong and pernicious. Be it here once and for all understood that no sentimental and theoretic love for the common sailor, no romantic belief in that peculiar noble-heartedness and exaggerated generosity of disposition fictitiously imputed to him in novels, and no prevailing desire to gain the reputation of his being his friend, have actuated me in anything I have said, in any part of this work, touching the gross oppression under which I know that the sailor suffers. Indifferent as to who may be the parties concerned, I but desire to see wrongs righted, and equal justice administered to all. Nor, as has been elsewhere hinted, is the general ignorance of depravity of any race of men to be alleged as an apology for tyranny over them. On the contrary, it cannot admit of a reasonable doubt in any unbiased mind conversant with the interior life of a man of war that most of the sailor iniquities practiced therein are indirectly to be ascribed to the morally debasing effect of the unjust, despotic, and degrading laws under which the man-of-war's man lives. Chapter 73. Night and Day Gambling in a Man-of-War. Mention has been made that the game of draughts or checkers was permitted to be played on board the Neversink. At the present time, while there was little or no shipwork to be done, and all hands in high spirits were sailing homeward over the warm smooth sea of the tropics, so numerous became the players scattered about the decks that our first lieutenant used ironically to say that it was a pity they were not tessellated with squares of white and black marble for the express benefit and convenience of the players. Had this gentleman had his way, our checkerboards would very soon have been pitched out of the ports, but the captain, usually lenient in some things, permitted them, and so Mr. Bridewell was fain to hold his peace. But although this one game was allowable in the frigate, all kinds of gambling were strictly interdicted, under the penalty of the gangway. Nor were cards or dice tolerated in any way whatever. This regulation was indispensable, for of all human beings, man-of-war's men are perhaps the most inclined to gambling. The reason must be obvious to anyone who reflects upon their condition on shipboard. And gambling, the most mischievous of vices anywhere, in a man-of-war operates still more perniciously than on shore. But quite as often as the law against smuggling spirits is transgressed by the unscrupulous sailors, the statutes against cards and dice are evaded. Sable night, which, since the beginning of the world, has winked and looked on at so many deeds of iniquity, night is the time usually selected for their operations by man-of-war gamblers. The place pitched upon is generally the berth deck, where the hammocks are swung, and which is lighted so stintedly as not to disturb the sleeping seamen with any obtruding glare. In so spacious an area, the two lanterns swinging from the stanchions diffuse a subdued illumination, like a night taper in the apartment of some invalid. Owing to their position also, these lanterns are far from shedding an impartial light, however dim, but fling long, angular rays here and there, like burglars' dark lanterns, in the 50-acre vaults of the West India docks on the Thames. It may well be imagined, therefore, how well adapted is this mysterious and subterranean hall of Iblis to the clandestine proceedings of gamblers, especially as the hammocks not only hang thickly, but many of them swing very low, within 2 feet of the floor, thus forming innumerable little canvas glens, grottos, nooks, corners, and crannies, where a good deal of wickedness may be practiced by the wary with considerable impunity. Now the master-at-arms, assisted by his mates, the ship's corporals, reigns supreme in these bowels of the ship. Throughout the night, these policemen relieve each other at standing guard over the premises, and except when the watches are called, they sit in the midst of a profound silence, only invaded by trumpeters' snores, or the ramblings of some old sheet-anchor man in his sleep. The 2 ship's corporals went among the sailors by the names of Leggs and Pounce. Pounce had been a policeman, it was said, in Liverpool. Leggs, a turnkey attached to the Tombs in New York. Hence their education eminently fitted them for their stations, and Bland, the master-at-arms, ravished with their dexterity in prying out offenders, used to call them his 2 right hands. When man-of-war's men desire to gamble, they appoint the hour and select some certain corner, in some certain shadow, behind some certain hammock. They then contribute a small sum toward a joint fund to be invested in a bribe for some Argoside shipmate, who shall play the part of the spy upon the master-at-arms and corporals while the gaming is in progress. In 9 cases out of 10, these arrangements are so cunning and comprehensive that the gamblers, eluding all vigilance, conclude their game unmolested. But now and then, seduced into unwariness, or perhaps from parsimony, being unwilling to employ the services of a spy, they are suddenly lighted upon by the constables, remorselessly collared, and dragged into the brig, there to await a dozen lashes in the morning. Several times at midnight, I had been startled out of a sound sleep by a sudden, violent rush under my hammock, caused by the abrupt breaking up of some nest of gamblers who have scattered in all directions, brushing under the tiers of swinging pallets and setting them all in rocking commotion. It is, however, while laying in port that gambling most thrives in a man-of-war. Then the men frequently practice their dark deeds in the light of the day, and the additional guards which at such times they deem indispensable are not unworthy of note. More especially, their extra precautions in engaging the services of several spies necessitate a considerable expenditure, so that in port the diversion of gambling rises to the dignity of a nabob luxury. During the day, the master-at-arms and his corporals are continually prowling about on all three decks, eager to spy out iniquities. At one time, for example, you see Legs switching his magisterial rattan, and lurking round the foremast on the spar deck. The next moment, perhaps he is 3 decks down, out of sight, prowling among the cable tiers, just so with his master, and Pounce, his coadjutor. They are here, there, and everywhere, seemingly gifted with ubiquity. In order successfully to carry on their proceedings by day, the gamblers must see to it that each of these constables is relentlessly dogged wherever he goes, so that, in case of his approach toward the spot where they themselves are engaged, they may be warned of the fact in time to make good their escape. Accordingly, light and active scouts are selected to follow the constable about, from their youthful alertness and activity. The boys of the mizentop are generally chosen for this purpose. But this is not all. On board of most men of war there is a set of sly, knavish foxes among the crew, destitute of every principle of honor, and on a par with Irish informers. In a man-of-war parlance they come under the denomination of fancy men and white mice. They are called fancy men because their zeal in craftily reporting offenders. They are presumed to be regarded with high favor by some of the officers, though it is seldom that these informers can be certainly individualized. So secret and subtle are they in laying their information. Yet certain of the crew, and especially certain of the Marines, are invariably suspected to be fancy men and white mice, and are accordingly more or less hated by their comrades. Now, in addition to having an eye on the master-at-arms and his aides, the day gamblers must see to it that every person suspected of being a white mouse or fancy man is likewise dogged wherever he goes. Additional scouts are retained constantly to snuff at their trail, but the mysteries of man-of-war vice are wonderful, and it is now to be recorded that, from long habit and observation, and familiarity with the guardo moves and maneuvers of a frigate, the master-at-arms and his aides can most invariably tell when any gambling is going on by day. Though, in the crowded vessel, abounding in decks, tops, dark places, and outlandish corners of all sorts, they may not be able to pounce upon the identical spot where the gamblers are hidden. During the period that Bland was suspended from his office as master-at-arms, a person who, among the sailors, went by the name of Sneak, having been long suspected to have been a white mouse, was put in Bland's place. He proved a hangdog, sidelong catch-thief, but gifted with a marvelous perseverance in ferreting out culprits, following in their track like an inevitable Cuba bloodhound, with his noiseless nose. When disconcerted, however, you sometimes heard his bay. "The muffled dice are somewhere around," Sneak would say to his aides. "There are them 3 chaps there, been dogging me for about the last half hour. I say, Pounce, has anyone been scouting around you this morning?" "4 on 'em," says Pounce. "I knowed it. I knowed the muffled dice was rattling." "Legs," says the master-at-arms to his other aide. "Legs, how is it with you? Any spies?" "10 on 'em," says Legs. "There's one of 'em now, that fellow stitching a hat." "Hallo, you sir," cried the master-at-arms. "Top your boom and sail large, now. If I see you about me again, I'll have you up to the mast." "What am I a-doing now?" says the hat stitcher, with a face as long as a rope walk. "Can't a feller be working here without being inspected of Tom Coxon's traverse? Up one ladder and down the other?" "Oh, I know the move, sir. I have been on board a guardo. Top your boom, I say, and be off, or I'll have you hauled up and riveted in a clinch. Both foretacks over the main yard, and no bloody knife to cut the season. Sheer, or I'll pitch you in like a shin of beef into a beggar's wallet." It is often observable that, in vessels of all kinds, the men who talk the most sailor lingo are the least sailor-like in reality. You may sometimes hear even Marines jerk out more salt phrases than the captain of the forecastle himself. On the other hand, when not actively engaged in his vocation, you would take the best specimen of a seaman for a landsman. When you see a fellow yawning about the docks like a homeward-bound Indiaman, a long Commodore's pennant of black ribbon flying from his masthead, and fetching up at a grog shop with a slew of his hull, as if an admiral were coming alongside a 3-decker in his barge, you may put that man down for what men-of-war's men call damn-my-eyes tar, that is, a humbug. And many damn-my-eyes humbugs there are in this man-of-war world of ours. Chapter 74, The Maintop at Night. The whole of our run from Rio to the line was one delightful yachting, so far as fine weather and the ship's sailing were concerned. It was especially pleasant when our quarter watch lounged in the maintop, diverting ourselves in many agreeable ways. Removed from the immediate presence of the officers, we there harmlessly enjoyed ourselves, more than in any other part of the ship. By day, many of us were very industrious, making hats or mending our clothes, but by night we became more romantically inclined. Often Jack Chase, an enthusiastic admirer of sea scenery, would direct our attention to the moonlight on the waves by fine snatches from his catalogue of poets. I shall never forget the lyric air with which, one morning, at dawn of day, when all the east was flushed with red and gold, he stood leaning against the topmast shrouds and stretching his bold hands over the sea, exclaimed, "Here comes Aurora, topmates, see," and in a liquid, long-lingering tone he recited the lines, "With gentle hand, as seeming oft to pause, the purple curtains of the morn she draws. Commodore Cammons, white jacket, but a bare hand there, we must rig out that stunsail boom. The wind is shifting." From our lofty perch of a moonlit night, the frigate itself was a glorious sight. She was going large before the wind, her stunsails set on both sides, so that the canvas on the mainmast and foremast presented the appearance of majestic, tapering pyramids, more than 100 feet broad at the base, and terminating in the clouds with the light copestone of the royals. That immense area of snow-white canvas sliding along the sea was indeed a magnificent spectacle. The three shrouded masts looked like the apparitions of three gigantic Turkish emirs striding over the ocean. Nor at times was the sound of music wanting to augment the poetry of the scene. The whole band would be assembled on the poop, regaling the officers and incidentally ourselves with their fine old airs. To these, some of us would occasionally dance in the top, which was almost as large as any ordinary-sized parlor. When the instrumental melody of the band was not to be had, our nightingales mustered their voices and gave us a song. Upon these occasions, Jack Chase was often called out and regaled us in his own free and noble style with the Spanish ladies, a favorite thing with British man-of-war's men, and many other salt-sea ballads and ditties, including Sir Patrick Spens was the best sailor that ever sailed the sea. Also, and 3 times around spun our gallant ship, 3 times around spun she. 3 times around spun our gallant ship, and she went to the bottom of the sea. The sea, the sea, the sea, and she went to the bottom of the sea. These songs would be varied by sundry yarns and twisters of our top men, and it was at these times that I was always endeavored to draw out the oldest Tritons into narratives of the war service they had seen. There were but few of them, it is true, who had been in action, but that only made their narratives the more valuable. There was an old Negro who went by the name of Tawny, a sheet-anchor man, whom we often invited into our top of tranquil nights to hear him discourse. He was a staid and sober seaman, very intelligent, with a fine frank bearing, one of the best men in the ship, and held in high estimation by everyone. It seems that during the last war between England and America, he had with several others been impressed upon the high seas out of a New England merchantman. The ship that impressed him was an English frigate, the Macedonian, afterward taken by the Neversink, the ship in which we were sailing. It was the Holy Sabbath, according to Tawney, and as the Britons bore down on the American, Hermann at their quarters, Tawney and his countrymen, who happened to be stationed at the quarterdeck battery, respectfully accosted the captain, an old man by the name of Carden, as he passed them in his rapid promenade, his spyglass under his arm. Again they assured him that they were not Englishmen, and that it was a most bitter thing to lift their hands against the flag of that country which harbored the mothers that bore them. They conjured him to release them from their guns, and allowed them to remain neutral during the conflict. But when a ship of any nation is running into action, it is no time for argument, no small time for justice, and not much time for humanity. Snatching a pistol from the belt of a boarder standing by, the captain leveled it at the heads of the 3 sailors, and commanded them instantly to their quarters, under penalty of being shot on the spot. So, side by side with his country's foes, Tawney and his companions toiled at the guns and fought out the last, with the exception of one of them, who was killed at his post by one of his own country's balls. At length, having lost her fore and maintop masts and her mizzen mast having been shot away to the deck, and her foreyard lying in 2 pieces on her shattered forecastle, and in 100 places having been holed with round shot, the English frigate was reduced to the last extremity. Captain Carden ordered his signal quartermaster to strike the flag. Tawney was one of those who at last helped pull him on board the Neversink. As he touched the deck, Carden saluted Decatur, the hostile commander, and offered his sword, but it was courteously declined. Perhaps the victor remembered the dinner parties that he and the Englishman had enjoyed together in Norfolk just previous to the breaking out of hostilities, and while both were in command of the very frigates now crippled on the sea, the Macedonian, it seems, had gone into Norfolk with dispatches. Then they had laughed and joked over their wine, and a wager of a beaver hat was said to have been made between them upon the event of the hostile meeting of their ships. Gazing upon the heavy batteries before them, Carden said to Decatur, "This is a 74, not a frigate. No wonder the day is yours." This remark was founded upon the Neversink's superiority in guns. The Neversink's main deck batteries then consisted, as now, of 24-pounders, the Macedonians of only 18s. In all, the Neversink numbered 54 guns and 450 men, the Macedonian 49 guns and 300 men. A very great disparity, which, united to the other circumstances of this action, deprives the victory of all claims to glory beyond those that might be set up by a river horse getting the better of a seal. But if Tawney spoke truth, and he was a truth-telling man, this fact seemed counterbalanced by a circumstance he related. When the guns of the Englishmen were examined after the engagement, in more than one instance the wad was found rammed against the cartridge without intercepting the ball. And though in a frantic sea fight such a thing might be imputed to hurry and remissness, yet Tawney, a stickler for his tribe, always ascribed it to quite a different and less honorable cause. But even granting the cause he assigned to have been the true one, it does not involve anything inimical to the general valor displayed by the British crew. Yet from all that may be learned from candid persons who have been in sea fights, there can be but little doubt that on board of all ships of whatever nation, in time of action, no very small number of the men are exceedingly nervous, to say the least, at the guns, ramming and sponging at a venture. And what special patriotic interest could have impressed a man, for instance, taken a fight into which he had been dragged from the arms of his wife? Or is it to be wondered at that impressed English seamen have not scrupled in a time of war to cripple the arm that has enslaved them? During the same general war which prevailed at and previous to the period of the frigate action here spoken of, a British flag officer, in writing to the Admiralty, said, "Everything appears to be quiet in the fleet. But in preparing for battle last week, several of the guns in the after part of the ship were found to be spiked, that is to say, rendered useless. Who has spiked them? The dissatisfied seamen. It is altogether improbable, then, that the guns to which Tawney referred were manned by men who purposely refrained from making them tell on the foe. That, in this one action, the victory America gained was partly won for her by the sulky insubordination of the enemy itself? During this self-same period of general war, it was frequently the case that the guns of English armed ships were found in the mornings with their breechings cut overnight. This maiming of the guns, and for the time incapacitating them, was only to be imputed to that secret spirit of hatred to the service which induced the spiking above referred to. But even in cases where no deep-seated dissatisfaction was presumed to prevail among the crew, and where a seaman in time of action impelled by pure fear shirked from his gun, it seems but flying in the face of him who made such a seaman what he constitutionally was, to so coward upon his back, and degrade and agonize the already trembling wretch in numberless other ways. Nor seems it a practice warranted by the Sermon of the Mount, for the officer of a battery, in time of battle, to stand over the men with his drawn sword, as was done in the Macedonian, and run through on the spot the first seaman who showed a semblance of fear. Tawney told me that he distinctly heard this order given by the English captain to his officers of divisions. Were the secret history of all sea fights written, the laurels of sea heroes would turn to ashes on their brows. And how nationally disgraceful in every conceivable point of view is the fourth of our American Articles of War. If any person in the Navy shall pusillanimously cry for quarter, he shall suffer death. Thus, with death before his face from the foe, and death behind his back from his countrymen, the best valor of a man-of-war's man can never assume the merit of a noble spontaneousness. In this, as in every other case, the Articles of War held out no reward for good conduct, but only compel the sailor to fight, like a hired murderer, for his pay, by digging his grave before his eyes if he hesitates. But this Article 4 is open to still graver objections. Courage is the most common and vulgar of the virtues, the only one shared with us by the beasts of the field, the one most apt by excess to run into viciousness. And since nature generally takes away with one hand to counterbalance her gifts with the other, excessive animal courage in many cases only finds room in a character vacated of loftier things. But in a naval officer, animal courage is exalted to the loftiest merit, and often procures him a distinguished command. Hence, if some brainless bravo be captain of a frigate in action, he may fight her against invincible odds, and seek to crown himself with the glory of the shambles, by permitting his hopeless crew to be butchered before his eyes, while at the same time that crew must consent to be slaughtered by the foe under penalty of being murdered by the law. Look at the engagement between the American frigate Essex and the two English cruisers, the Phoebe and the Cherub, off the Bay of Valparaiso during the late war. It is admitted on all hands that the American captain continued to fight his crippled ship against that greatly superior force, and when at last it became physically impossible that he could ever be otherwise than vanquished in the end, and when, from peculiarly unfortunate circumstances, his men merely stood up to their nearly useless batteries to be dismembered and blown to pieces by the incessant fire of the enemy's long guns, nor by thus continuing to fight did this American frigate one iota promote the true interests of her country. I seek not to underrate any reputation which the American captain may have gained by this battle. He was a brave man, that no sailor will deny. But the whole world is made up of brave men, yet I would not at all be understood as impugning his special good name. Nevertheless, it is not to be doubted that if there were any common-sense sailors at the guns of Essex, however valiant they may have been, those common-sense sailors must have greatly preferred to strike their flag, when they saw the day was fairly lost, than postpone that inevitable act till there were few American arms left to assist in hauling it down. Yet had these men, under these circumstances, pusillanimously cried for quarter by the 4th Article of War, they might have been legally hung. According to the Negro Tawney, when the captain of the Macedonian, seeing that the Neversink had his vessel completely in her power, gave the word to strike the flag, one of his officers, a man hated by the seamen for his tyranny, howled out the most terrific remonstrances, swearing that for his part he would not give up, but was for sinking the Macedonian alongside the enemy. Had he been captain, doubtless he would have done so, thereby gaining the name of a hero in this world. But what would they have called him in the next? But as the whole matter of war is a thing that smites common sense and Christianity in the face, so everything connected with it is utterly foolish, unchristian, barbarous, brutal, and savoring of the Fiji Islands, cannibalism, saltpeter, and the devil. It is generally the case in a man of war when he strikes her flag that all discipline is at an end, and the men for a time are ungovernable. This was so on board of the English frigate. The spirit room was broken open, and buckets of grog were passed along the decks, where many of the wounded were lying between the guns. These mariners seized the buckets, and, spite of all remonstrances, gulped down the burning spirits, till, as Tawney said, the blood suddenly spirited out of their wounds, and they fell dead to the deck. The Negro had many more stories to tell of this fight, and frequently he would escort me along our main deck batteries, still mounting the same guns used in the battle, pointing out their ineffaceable indentations and scars. Coated over with the accumulated paint of more than 30 years, they were almost invisible to a casual eye, but Tawney knew them all by heart, for he had returned home in the Neversink and had beheld these scars shortly after the engagement. One afternoon, I was walking with him along the gun deck, when he paused abreast of the main mast. "This part of the ship," said he, "we call the slaughterhouse on board the Macedonian. Here the men fell 5 and 6 at a time. An enemy always directs its shots here, in order to hurl over the mast if possible. The beams and carlines overhead in the Macedonian slaughterhouse were spattered with blood and brains. About the hatchways it looked like a butcher's stall, bits of human flesh sticking to the ring bolts. A pig that ran about the decks escaped unharmed, but his hide was so clotted with blood from rooting among the pools of gore that when the ship struck, the sailors hove the animal overboard, swearing that it would be rank cannibalism to eat him. Another quadruped, a goat, lost its forelegs in this fight. The sailors who were killed, according to the usual custom, were ordered to be thrown overboard as soon as they fell, no doubt, as the Negro said, that the sight of so many corpses lying around might not appall the survivors at the guns. Among other instances, he related the following. A shot entering one of the portholes dashed dead 2/3 of the gun's crew. The captain of the next gun, dropping his lockstring, which he had just pulled, turned over the heap of bodies to see who they were. When perceiving an old messmate who had sailed with him in many cruises, he burst into tears, and taking the corpse up in his arms and going with it to the side, held it over the water a moment, and eyeing it cried, "Oh God, Tom, damn your prayers over that thing, overboard with it and down to your gun." Roared a wounded lieutenant. The order was obeyed, and the heart-stricken sailor returned to his post. Tawney's recitals were enough to snap this man-of-war's world sword in his scabbard. And thinking of all the cruel, carnal glory wrought out by naval heroes in scenes like these, I asked myself whether indeed that was a glorious coffin in which Lord Nelson was entombed, a coffin presented to him during life by Captain Hallowell. It had been dug out of the mainmost of the French line of battleship L'Orient, which, burning up with British fire, destroyed hundreds of Frenchmen at the Battle of the Nile. Peace to Lord Nelson where he sleeps in his mouldering mast, but rather would I be urned in the trunk of some green tree, and even in death had the vital sap circulating round me, giving of my dead body to the living foliage that shaded my peaceful tomb. Chapter 75. Sink, Burn, and Destroy. Printed Admiralty Orders in Time of War. Among innumerable yarns and twisters reeled off in our main top during our pleasant run to the north, none could match those of Jack Chase, our captain. Never was there better company than ever glorious Jack. The things which most men only read of or dream about, he had seen and experienced. He had been a dashing smuggler in his day, and could tell of a long 9-pounder rammed home with wads of French silks, of cartridges stuffed with the finest gunpowder tea, of canisters shot full of West India sweetmeats, of sailor frocks and trousers, quilted inside with costly laces, and table legs, hollow as musket barrels, compactly stowed with rare drugs and spices. He could tell of a wicked widow, too, a beautiful receiver of smuggled goods upon the English coast, who smiled so sweetly upon the smugglers when they sold her silks and laces, cheap as tape and ginghams. She called them gallant fellows, hearts of game, and bade them bring her more. He could tell of desperate fights with his British Majesty's cutters, in midnight coves upon a stormy coast, of the capture of a reckless band, and their being drafted on board a man of war, of their swearing that their chief was slain, of a writ of habeas corpus sent on board for one of them for a debt. A reserved and handsome man, and his going ashore strongly suspected of being the slaughtered captain, and this a successful scheme for his escape. But more than all, Jack could tell of the Battle of Navarino, for he had been captain of one of the main deck guns on board Admiral Codrington's flagship, the Asia. Were mine the style of stout old Chapman's Homer, even then I would scarce venture to give noble Jack's own version of this fight, whereon on the 20th of October, A.D. 1827, 32 sail of Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Russians attacked and vanquished in the Levant and Ottoman fleet of 3 ships of the line, 25 frigates, and a swarm of fireships and hornet craft. We bade to be at them, said Jack, and when we did open fire, we were like dolphin among the flying fish. Every man take his bird was the cry, and when we trained our guns. And those guns all smoked like rows of Dutch pipe bowls, my hearties. My guns' crew carried small flags in their bosoms, to nail to the mast in case the ship's colors were shot away. Stripped to the waistbands, we fought like skinned tigers, and bowled down the Turkish frigates like ninepins. Among their shrouds, swarming thick with small-armed men like flights of pigeons lighted on pine trees, our marines sent their leaden peace, and gooseberries like a shower of hailstones in Labrador. It was a stormy time, my hearties. The blasted Turks pitched into the old Asia's hull a whole quarry of marble shot, each ball 150 pounds. They knocked 3 portholes into one, but we gave them better than they sent. Up and at them, my bulldog, said I, patting my gun on the breech. Tear open hatchways in their Moslem sides. White Jacket, my lad, you ought to have been there. The bay was covered with masts and yards, as I have seen a raft of snags in the Arkansas River. Showers of burned rice and olives from the exploding foe fell upon us like manna in the wilderness. Allah, Allah, Muhammad, Muhammad, split the air. Some cried it out of the Turkish portholes. Others shrieked it forth from the drowning waters, their top knots floating on their shaven skulls, like black snakes on half-tide rocks. By those top knots, they believed that their prophet would drag them up to paradise, but they sank 50 fathoms, my hearties, to the bottom of the bay. Ain't the bloody Hometons going to strike yet? Cried my first loader, a Guernsey man thrusting his neck out of the porthole and looking at the Turkish line of battleship nearby. That instant his head blew by me like a bursting Pasian shot, and the flag of Neb Knowles himself was hauled down forever. We dragged his hull to one side and avenged him with the Cooper's anvil, which, endways, we rammed home. A messmate shoved in the dead body's bloody Scotch cap for the wad, and sent it flying into the line of battleship. By the god of war, boys, we hardly left enough of that craft to boil a pot of water with. It was a hard day's work, a sad day's work, my hearties. That night, when all was over, I slept sound enough with a box of canister shot from my pillow, But you ought to have seen the boatload of Turkish flags one of our captains carried home. He swore to dress his father's orchard in colors with them, just as our spars were dressed for a gala day. Though you tormented the Turks at Navarino, noble Jack, yet you came off yourself with only the loss of a splinter, it seems, said a top man, glancing at our captain's maimed hand. Yes, but I and one of the lieutenants had a narrower escape than that. A shot struck the side of my porthole and sent the splinters right and left. One took off my hat, rim clean to my brow. Another razed the lieutenant's left boot by slicing off the heel. A third shot killed my powder monkey without touching him. How, Jack? It whizzed the poor babe dead. He was seated on a cheese of wads at the time, and after the dust of the powdered bulwarks had blown away, I noticed he yet sat still, his eyes wide open. My little hero, cried I, and I clapped him on the back, but he fell on his face at my feet. I touched his heart and found he was dead. There was not a little finger mark on him. Silence now fell upon the listeners for a time, broken at last by the second captain of the top. Noble Jack, I know you never brag, but tell us what you did yourself that day. Why, my hearties, I did not do quite as much as my gun, but I flatter myself it was that gun that brought down the Turkish admiral's main mast, and the stump left wasn't long enough to make a wooden leg for Lord Nelson. How? But I thought, by the way you pull a lock string on board here, and look along the sight, that you can steer a shot about right, hey, Jack? It was the admiral of the fleet, God Almighty, who directed the shot that dismasted the Turkish admiral, said Jack. I only pointed the gun. But how did you feel, Jack, when the musket ball carried away one of your hooks there? Feel? Only a finger the lighter. I have 7 more left, besides thumbs, and they did good service, too, in the torn rigging the day after the fight. For you must know, my hearties, that the hardest work comes after the guns are run in. 3 days I helped work, with one hand in the rigging, and in the same trousers that I wore in the action. The blood had dried and stiffened. They looked like glazed red Morocco. Now, this Jack Chase had a heart in him like a mastodon's. I have seen him weep when a man has been flogged at the gangway, yet, in relating the story of the Battle of Navarino, he plainly showed that he held the God of the blessed Bible to have been the British Commodore in the Levant on the bloody 20th of October, A.D. 1827. And thus it would seem that war almost makes blasphemers out of best of men, and brings them all down to the Fiji standard of humanity. Some man-of-war's men have confessed to me that as the battle has raged more and more, their hearts have hardened in infernal harmony, and like their own guns, they have fought without a thought. Soldier or sailor, the fighting man is but a fiend, and the staff and bodyguard of the devil musters many a baton. But war at times is inevitable. Must the national honor be trampled underfoot by an insolent foe? Say on, but you know this, and lay it to heart, war-voting bench of bishops, that he on whom we believe himself has enjoined us to turn the left cheek if the right be smitten. Never mind what follows. That passage you cannot expunge from the Bible. That passage is as binding upon us as any other. That passage embodies the soul and substance of the Christian faith. Without it, Christianity were like any other faith. And that passage will yet, by the blessing of God, turn the world. But in some things we must turn Quakers first. But though unlike most scenes of carnage which have proved useless murders of men, Admiral Codrington's victory undoubtedly achieved the emancipation of Greece and terminated the Turkish atrocities in that tomahawk state. Yet who shall lift his hand and swear that a divine providence led the van of the combined fleets of England, France, and Russia at the Battle of Navarino? For if this be so, then it led the van against the Church's own elect, the persecuted Waldenses in Switzerland, and kindled the Smithfield fires in Bloody Mary's time. But all events are mixed in a fusion indistinguishable. What we call fate is even heartless and impartial, not a fiend to kindle bigot flames, nor a philanthropist to espouse the cause of Greece. We may fret, fume, and fight, but the thing called fate everlastingly sustains an armed neutrality. Yet, though all this be so, nevertheless, in our own hearts, we mold the whole world's hereafters, and in our own hearts we fashion our own gods. Each mortal casts his vote for whom he will to rule the worlds. I have a voice that helps to shape eternity, and my volitions stir the orbits of the furthest suns. In 2 senses, we are precisely what we worship, ourselves our fate. Chapter 76. The Chains. When wearied with the tumult and occasional contention of the gun deck of our frigate, I have often retreated to a porthole and calmed myself down by gazing broad off upon a placid sea. After the battle din of the last 2 chapters, let us now do the like, and in the sequestered forechains of the Neversink tranquilize ourselves, if we may. Notwithstanding the domestic communism to which the seamen in a men of war are condemned, and the publicity in which actions the most diffident and retiring in their nature must be performed, there is yet an odd corner or two where you may yet sometimes steal away, and for a few moments almost be private. Chief among these places is the chains, to which I would sometimes hie during our pleasant homeward bound glide over those pensive tropical latitudes. After hearing my fill of the wild yarns of our top, here would I recline, if not disturbed, serenely concocting information into wisdom. The chains designates the small platform outside of the hull, at the base of the large shrouds leading down from the 3 mastheads to the bulwarks. At present, they seem to be getting out of vogue among merchant vessels, along with the fine old-fashioned quarter galleries, little turret-like appurtenances which, in the days of old admirals, set off the angles of an armed ship's stern. Here a naval officer might lounge away an hour after action, smoking a cigar to drive out of his whiskers the villainous smoke of the gunpowder. The picturesque, delightful stern gallery also, a broad balcony overhanging the sea, and entered from the captain's cabin, much as you might enter a bower from a lady's chamber. This charming balcony where, sailing over summer seas in the days of the old Peruvian viceroys, the Spanish cavalier Mendana of Lima made love to the Lady Isabella as they voyaged in quest of the Solomon Islands, the fabulous Ophir, the grand Cyclades. And the Lady Isabella at sunset blushed like the Orient, and gazed down to the goldfish and silver-hued flying fish that wove the woof and warp of their wakes in bright, scaly tartans and plaids underneath where the lady reclined. This charming balcony, exquisite retreat, has been cut away by vandalic innovations. Aye, that claw-footed old gallery is no longer in fashion in Commodore's eyes, is no longer genteel. Out on all furniture fashions but those that are past. Give me my grandfather's old armchair, planted upon 4 carved frogs, as the Hindus fabled the world to be supported on 4 tortoises. Give me his cane with the gold-loaded top, a cane that, like the musket of General Washington's father and the broadsword of William Wallace, would break down the back of the switch-carrying dandies of these spindle-shank days. Give me his broad-breasted vest, coming bravely down over the hips and furnished with 2 strong boxes of pockets to keep guineas in. Toss this toppling cylinder of a beaver overboard, and give me my grandfather's gallant, gable-ended cocked hat. But though the quarter galleries and the stern gallery of a man of war are departed, yet the chains still linger, nor can there be imagined a more agreeable retreat. The huge blocks and lanyards forming the pedestals of the shrouds divide the chains into numerous little chapels, alcoves, niches, and altars, where you lazily lounge. Outside of the ship, though on board, there are plenty to divide a good thing with you in this man-of-war world. Often, when snugly seated in one of these little alcoves, gazing off to the horizon and thinking of Cathay, I have been startled from my repose by some old quarter-gunner, who, having newly painted a parcel of match-tubs, wanted to set them to dry. At other times, one of the tattooing artists would crawl over the bulwarks, followed by his sitter, and then a bare arm or leg would be extended, and the disagreeable business of pricking commence, right under my eyes. Or an interruption of tars, with ditty bags or sea reticles, and piles of old trousers to mend, would break in upon my seclusion, and forming a sewing circle, drive me off with their chatter. But once, it was a Sunday afternoon, I was pleasantly reclining in a particularly shady and secluded little niche between 2 lanyards, when I heard a low, supplicating voice. Peeping through the narrow space between the ropes, I perceived an aged seaman on his knees, his face turned toward seaward, with closed eyes buried in prayer. Softly rising, I stole through a porthole, and left the venerable worshipper alone. He was a sheet-anchor man, an earnest Baptist, and was well known in his part of the ship to be constant in his solitary devotions in the chains. He reminded me of St. Anthony going out into the wilderness to pray. This man was captain of the starboard bow chaser, one of the 2 long 24-pounders on the forecastle. In time of action, the command of that iron talib of the destroyer would devolve upon him. It would be his business to train it properly, to see it well loaded, the grape and canister rammed home, also to prick the cartridge, take the sight, and give the word for the matchman to apply his wand, bidding a sudden hell to flash forth from the muzzle in wide combustion and death. Now this captain of the bow chaser was an upright old man, a sincere, humble believer, and he but earned his bread in being captain of that gun. But how with those hands of his begrimed with powder could he break that other and most peaceful and penitent bread of the supper? though in that hallowed sacrament it seemed he had often partaken ashore. The omission of this rite in a man of war, though there is a chaplain to preside over it, and at least a few communicants to partake, must be ascribed to a sense of religious propriety in the last degree to be commended. Ah, the best righteousness of our man-of-war world seems but an unrealized ideal, after all. And those maxims which in the hope of bringing about a millennium we busily teach to the heathen, we Christians ourselves disregard in view of the whole present social framework of our world, so ill-adapted to the practical adoption of the meekness of Christianity. There seems almost some ground for the thought that although our blessed Savior was full of the wisdom of heaven, yet his gospel seems lacking in the practical wisdom of earth. In a due appreciation of the necessities of nations at times demanding bloody massacres and wars, in a proper estimation of the value of rank, title, and money. But all this only the more crowns the divine consistency of Jesus, since Burnet and the best theologians demonstrate that his nature was not merely human, was not that of a mere man of the world. Chapter 77. The Hospital and a Man of War. After running with a fine steady breeze up to the line, it fell calm, and there we lay 3 days enchanted on the sea. We were a most puissant man of war, no doubt, with our 500 men, commodore and captain, backed by our long batteries of 32 and 24-pounders. Yet for all that, there we lay rocking, helpless as an infant in the cradle. Had it only been a gale instead of a calm, gladly would we have charged upon it with our gallant bowsprit, as with stout lance in rest. But as with mankind, this serene passive foe, unresisting and irresistible, lived it out, unconquered to the last. All these 3 days the heat was excessive, the sun drew the tar from the seams of the ship, the awnings were spread fore and aft, the decks were kept constantly sprinkled with water. It was during this period that a sad event occurred, though not an unusual one on shipboard. But in order to prepare for its narration, some account of the part of the ship called the sick bay must needs be presented. The sick bay is that part of a man of war where the invalid seamen are placed. In many respects it answers to a public hospital ashore. As with most frigates, the sick bay of the Neversink was on the berth deck, the third deck from above. It was in the extreme forward part of that deck, embracing the triangular area in the bows of the ship. It was therefore a subterranean vault, into which scarce a ray of heaven's glad light ever penetrated, even at noon. In a sea-going frigate, that was all her armament and stores on board. The floor of the berth deck is partly below the surface of the water. But in a smooth harbor, some circulation of air is maintained by opening large auger holes in the upper portion of the sides, called airports, not much above the water level. Before going to sea, however, these airports must be closed, caulked, and the seams hermetically sealed with pitch. These places for ventilation being shut, the sick bay is entirely barred against the free, natural admission of fresh air. In the Neversink, a few lungsful were forced down by artificial means, but as the ordinary windsail was the only method adopted, the quantity of fresh air sent down was regulated by the force of the wind. In a calm there was none to be had, while in a severe gale the windsail had to be hauled up on account of the violent draught flowing full upon the cots of the sick. An open work partition divided our sick bay from the rest of the deck, where the hammocks of the watch were slung. It therefore was exposed to all that uproar that ensued upon the watches being relieved. An official called the surgeon's steward, assisted by subordinates, presided over the place. It was the same individual alluded to as officiating at the amputation of the topman. He was always to be found at his post by night and by day. This surgeon's steward deserves of description. He was a small, pale, hollow-eyed man, with that peculiar Lazarus-like expression so often noticed in hospital attendants. Seldom or never did you see him on deck, and when he did emerge into the light of the sun, it was with an abashed look and an uneasy, winking eye. The sun was not made for him. His nervous organization was confounded by the sight of the robust old sea dogs on the forecastle and the general tumult of the spar deck, and he mostly buried himself below in an atmosphere which long habit had made congenial. This young man never indulged in frivolous conversation. He only talked of the surgeon's prescriptions. His every word was a bolus. He never was known to smile, nor did he even look sober in the ordinary way, but his countenance ever wore an aspect of cadaverous resignation to his fate. Strange that so many of those who would fain minister to our own health should look so much like invalids themselves. connected with the sick bay over which the surgeon steward presided, but removed from it in place, being next door to the counting room of the purser's steward, was a regular apothecary shop of which he kept the key. He was fitted up precisely like an apothecary's on shore, displaying tiers of shelves on all four sides filled with green bottles and gallipots. Beneath were multitudinous drawers bearing incomprehensible gilded inscriptions in abbreviated Latin. He generally opened his shop for an hour or two every morning and evening. There was a Venetian blind in the upper part of the door, which he threw up then inside so as to admit a little air, and there you would see him, with a green shade over his eyes, seated on a stool, and pounding his pestle in a great iron mortar that looked like a howitzer, missing some jalapy compound. A smoky lamp shed a flickering yellow fever tinge upon his pallid face and the closely packed regiments of gallipots. Several times when I felt in need of a little medicine, but was not ill enough to report myself to the surgeon at his levees, I would call of a morning upon his steward at the sign of the mortar and beg him to give me what I wanted. Then, without speaking a word, this cadaverous young man would mix me my potion in a tin cup and hand it through the little opening in his door, like the little boxed-up treasurer giving you your change at the ticket office of a theater. But there was a little shelf against the wall of the door, and upon this I would set the tin cup for a while and survey it, for I never was a Julius Caesar taking medicine, and to take it in this way, without a single attempt at disguising it, with no counteracting little morsel to hurry down after it, in short, to go to the very apothecary's in person, and there, at the counter, swallow down your dose, as if it were a nice mint julep taken at the bar of a hotel. This was a bitter bolus indeed. But then this pallid young apothecary charged nothing for it, and that was no small satisfaction. For is it not remarkable, to say the least, that a shore apothecary should actually charge you money, round dollars and cents, for giving you a horrible nausea? My tin cup would wait a long time on that little shelf, yet Pills, as the sailor called him, never heeded my lingering, but in sober silent sadness continued pounding his mortar or folding up his powders, until at last some other customer would appear, and then in a sudden frenzy of resolution I would gulp down my sherry cobbler and carry its unspeakable flavor with me far up into the frigate's maintop. I did not know whether it was in the wide roll of the ship, as felt in that giddy perch that occasioned it, but I always got seasick after taking medicine and going aloft with it. Seldom or never did it do me any lasting good. Now the surgeon steward was only a subordinate of Surgeon Cuticle himself, who lived in the wardroom among the lieutenants, sailing master, chaplain, and purser. The surgeon is by law charged with the business of overlooking the general sanitary affairs of the ship. If anything is going on in any of its departments which he judges to be detrimental to the healthfulness of the crew, he has a right to protest against it formally to the captain. When a man is being scourged at the gangway, the surgeon stands by, and if he thinks that the punishment is becoming more than the culprit's constitution can well bear, he has a right to interfere and demand its cessation for the time. But though the Navy regulations nominally vest him with this high discretionary authority over the very Commodore himself, how seldom does he exercise it in cases where humanity demands it? 3 years is a long time to spend in one ship, and to be at swords points with its captain and lieutenants during such a period must be very unsocial and everywhere irksome. No otherwise than thus, at least, can the remissness of some surgeons in remonstrating against cruelty be accounted for. Not to speak again of the continual dampness of the decks consequent upon flooding them with salt water. When we were driving near to Cape Horn, it needs only to be mentioned that on board of the Neversink, men known to be in consumptions gasped under the scourge of the boatswain's mate when the surgeon and his 2 attendants stood by and never interposed. But where the unscrupulousness of martial discipline is maintained, it is in vain to attempt softening its rigor by the ordaining of humanitarian laws. Sooner might you tame the grizzly bear of Missouri than humanize a thing so essentially cruel and heartless. But the surgeon has yet other duties to perform. Not a seaman enters the Navy without undergoing a corporal examination to test his soundness in wind and limb. One of the first places into which I was introduced when I entered on board the Neversink was the sick bay, where I found one of the assistant surgeons seated at a green baize table. It was his turn for visiting the apartment, having been commanded by the deck officer to report my business to the functionary before me. I accordingly hemmed to attract his attention, and then catching his eye, politely intimated that I called upon him for the purpose of being accurately laid out and surveyed. "Strip," was the answer, and rolling up his gold-laced cuff, he proceeded to manipulate me. He punched me in the ribs, smote me across the chest, commanded me to stand on one leg and hold out the other horizontally. He asked me whether any of my family were consumptive, whether I felt a tendency to a rush of blood to the head, whether I was gouty, how often I had been bled during my life, how long I had been ashore, how long I had been afloat, with other several questions which altogether slipped my memory. He concluded his interrogatories with this extraordinary and unwarranted one: "Are you pious?" It was a leading question which somewhat staggered me, but I said not a word, when, feeling of my calves, he looked up and incomprehensibly said, "I'm afraid you're not." At length he declared me a sound animal, and wrote a certificate to that effect, with which I returned to the deck. This assistant surgeon turned out to be a very singular character, and when I became more acquainted with him, I ceased to marvel at the curious question with which he had concluded his examination of my person. He was a thin, knock-kneed man, with a sour, saturnine expression, rendered the more peculiar from his shaving his beard so remorselessly that his chin and cheeks always looked blue, as if pinched with cold. His long familiarity with nautical invalids seemed to have filled him full of theological hypos concerning the state of their souls. He was at once the physician and priest of the sick, washing down his boluses with ghostly consolation, and among the sailors went by the name of the Pelican, a fowl whose hanging pouch imparts to it a most chop-fallen, lugubrious expression. The privilege of going off duty and lying by when you are sick is one of the few points in which a man of war is far better for the sailor than a merchantman. But as with every other matter in the Navy, the whole thing is subject to the general discipline of the vessel, and if conducted with a severe, unyielding method and regularity, making no allowances for exception to rules. During the half-hour preceding morning quarters, the surgeon of a frigate is to be found in the sick bay, where, after going his rounds among the invalids, he holds a levee for the benefit of all new candidates for the sick list. If, after looking at your tongue and feeling of your pulse, he pronounces you a proper candidate, his secretary puts you down on his books, and you are thenceforth relieved from all duty, and have abundant leisure in which to recover your health. Let the boatswain blow, let the deck officer bellow, let the captain of your gun hunt you up, yet, if it can be answered by your messmates that you are on the down list, you ride it all out with impunity. The Commodore himself has then no authority over you, but must not be too much elated, for your immunities are only secure while you are immured in the dark hospital below. Should you venture to get a mouthful of fresh air on the spar deck, and be there discovered by an officer, you will in vain plead your illness. For it is quite impossible, it seems, that any true man-of-war invalid can be hardy enough to crawl up the ladders. Besides, the raw sea air, as they will tell you, is not good for the sick. But notwithstanding all this, notwithstanding the darkness and closeness of the sick bay, in which an alleged invalid must be content to shut himself up till the surgeon pronounces him cured, many instances occur, especially in protracted bad weather, where pretended invalids will submit to this dismissal hospital durance in order to escape hard work and wet jackets. There is a story told somewhere of the devil taking down the confessions of a woman on a strip of parchment, and being obliged to stretch it longer and longer with his teeth in order to find room for all the lady had to say. Much thus it was with our purser's steward, who had to lengthen out his manuscript sick list in order to accommodate all the names which were presented to him while we were off the pitch of Cape Horn. What sailors call the Cape Horn fever alarmingly prevailed, though it disappeared altogether when we got into the weather, which, as with any other invalids, was solely to be imputed to the wonder-working effects of an entire change of climate. It seems very strange, but it is really true that off Cape Horn some sogers of sailors will stand cupping and bleeding and blistering before they will budge. On the other hand, there are cases where a man actually sick and in need of medicine will refuse to go to the sick list, because in that case, his allowance of grog must be stopped. On board of every American man-of-war bound for sea, there is a goodly supply of wines and various delicacies put on board, according to law, for the benefit of the sick, whether officers or sailors. And one of the chicken coops is always reserved for the government chickens, destined for a similar purpose. But on board of the Neversink, the only delicacies given to invalid sailors was a little sago or arrowroot, and they did not get that unless severely ill. But so far as I could learn, no wine in any quantity was ever prescribed for them, though the government bottles often went into the wardroom for the benefit of indisposed officers. And though the government chicken coop was replenished at every port, yet not 4 pair of drumsticks were ever boiled into broth for sick sailors. Where the chickens went, someone must have known, but as I cannot vouch for it myself, I will not here back the hearty assertion of the men, which was that the pious pelican, true to his name, was extremely fond of poultry. I am still less disposed to believe this scandal from the continued leanness of the pelican, which could hardly have been the case did he nourish himself by so nutritious a dish as the drumsticks of fowls, a diet prescribed to pugilists in training. But who can avoid being suspicious of a very suspicious person? Pelican, I rather suspect you still. Chapter 78. Dismal Times in the Mess. It was on the first day of the long, hot calm which we had on the equator that a messmate of mine by the name of Shinley, who had been for some weeks complaining, at length went on the sick list. An old gunner's mate of the mess, Priming, the man with the hare lip, who true to his tribe was charged to the muzzle with bile, and moreover rammed home on top of it a wad of sailor superstition. This gunner's mate indulged in some gloomy and savage remarks, strangely tinged with genuine feeling and grief, at the announcement of the sickness of Shinley. Coming as it did not long after the almost fatal accident befalling poor Baldy, captain of the mizentop, another messmate of ours, and the dreadful fate of our amputated foretop man, whom we buried in Rio, also our messmate. We were cross-legged seated at dinner between the guns when the sad news concerning Shinley was first communicated. I knowed it, said Priming through his nose. Blast ye, I told you so, poor fella. But damn ye, I knowed it. This comes of having 13 in the mess. Hope you aren't dangerous, men. Poor Shinley, but blasted, it warn't till White Jacket there comed into the mess that these here things began. I don't believe there'll be more than 3 of us left by the time we strike soundings, men, but how is he now? How you been down to see him, any of you? Damn you, you Jonah, I don't see how you can sleep in your hammock knowing as you do that by making an odd number in the mess, you been the death of one poor fellow and ruined Baldy for life, and here's poor Shinley keeled up. Blast you and your jacket, say I. My dear messmate, I cried, don't blast me any more, for heaven's sake. Blast my jacket you may, and I'll join you in that, but don't blast me, for if you do, I shouldn't wonder if I myself was the next man to keel up. Gunner's mate, said Jack Chase, helping himself to a slice of beef and sandwiching it between 2 large biscuits. Gunner's mate, White Jacket there is my particular friend, and I would take it as a particular favor if you would knock off blasting him. It's in bad taste, rude, and unworthy a gentleman. Take your back away from that air gun carriage, will you now, Jack Chase? Cried Priming. In reply, just then, Jack happening to lean up against it. Must I be all the time cleaning after you fellas? Blast ye, I spent an hour on that air gun carriage this very morning. But it all comes to White Jacket there. If it warn't for having one too many, there wouldn't be any crowding and jamming in the mess. I'm blessed if we aren't choking a block here. Move farther up, I'm sitting on my leg. For God's sakes, gunner's mate, cried I. If it will content you, I and my jacket will leave the mess. I wish you would, and be to you, he replied. And if he does, you will mess alone, gunner's mate, said Jack Chase. That you will, cried all. And I wish to the Lord you'd let me, growled Priming, irritably rubbing his head with the handle of his sheath knife. You're an old bear, gunner's mate, said Jack Chase. I'm an old Turk, he replied, drawing the flat blade of his knife between his teeth, thereby producing a whetting, grating sound. Let him alone, men, said Jack Chase. Only keep off the tail of a rattlesnake and he'll not rattle. Look out he don't bite, though, said Priming, snapping his teeth, and with that he rolled off, growling as he went. Though I did my best to carry off my vexation with an air of indifference, need I say how I cursed my jacket, that it thus seemed the means of fastening on me the murder of one of my shipmates, and the probable murder of 2 more. For had it not been my jacket, doubtless, I had yet been a member of my old mess, and so have escaped making the luckless odd number among my present companions. All I could say in private to Priming had no effect, though I often took him aside to convince him of the philosophical impossibility of my having been accessory to the misfortunes of Baldy, the buried sailor in Rio, and Shinley. But Priming knew better. Nothing could move him, and he ever afterward eyed me as virtuous citizens do some notorious underhand villain going unhung of justice. Jacket, thou hast much to answer for, Jacket. Chapter 79. How man-of-war's men die at sea. Shinley, my sick messmate, was a middle-aged, handsome, intelligent seaman, whom some hard calamity or perhaps some unfortunate excess must have driven into the Navy. He told me he had a wife and 2 children in Portsmouth, in the state of New Hampshire. Upon being examined by Cuticle, the surgeon, He was, on purely scientific grounds, reprimanded by that functionary for not having previously appeared before him. He was immediately consigned to one of the invalid cots of a serious case. His complaint was of long standing, a pulmonary one, now attended with general prostration. The same evening he grew so much worse that according to man-of-war usage, we, his messmates, were officially notified that we must take our turns, sitting up with him through the night. We at once made our arrangements, allotting 2 hours for a watch. Not till the third night did my own turn come round. During the day preceding, it was stated at the mess that our poor messmate was run down completely. The surgeon had given him up. At 4 bells, 2 o'clock in the morning, I went down to relieve one of my messmates at the sick man's cot. The profound quietude of the calm pervaded the entire frigate through all her decks. The watch on duty were cozying on the carronade slides, far above the sick bay, and the watch below were fast asleep in their hammocks on the same deck with the invalid. Groping my way under these 200 sleepers, I entered the hospital. A dim lamp was burning on the table, which was screwed down to the floor. This light shed dreary shadows over the whitewashed walls of the place, making it look like a whited sepulchre underground. The windsail had collapsed and lay motionless on the deck. The low groans of the sick were the only sounds to be heard, and as I advanced, some of them rolled upon me their sleepless, silent, tormented eyes. "Fan him, and keep his forehead wet with this sponge," whispered my messmate, whom I came to relieve, as I drew near to Shenley's cot, "and wash the foam from his mouth. Nothing more can be done for him. If he dies before your watch is out, call the surgeon's steward. He sleeps in that hammock," pointing it out. Goodbye, messmate," he then whispered, stooping over the sick man, and so saying, he left the place. Shenley was lying on his back. His eyes were closed, forming 2 dark blue pits in his face. His breath was coming and going with a slow, long-drawn mechanical precision. It was the mere foundering hull of a man that was before me, and though it presented the well-known features of my messmates, yet I knew that the living soul of Shenley never more would look out of those eyes. So warm had it been during the day that the surgeon himself, when visiting the sick bay, had entered it in his shirt sleeves, and so warm was now the night that even in the lofty top I had worn but a loose linen frock and trousers. But in this subterranean sick bay, buried in the very bowels of the ship, and at sea, cut off from all ventilation, the heat of the night calm was intense, the sweat dripping from me as I had just emerged from a bath, and stripping myself naked to the waist, I sat by the side of the cot, and with a bit of crumpled paper put in my hand by the sailor I had relieved, kept fanning the motionless white face before me. I could not help thinking as I gazed whether this man's fate had not been accelerated by his confinement in this heated furnace below, and whether many a sick man round me might not soon improve, if not permitted to swing his hammock in the airy vacancies of the half-deck above, open to the portholes, but reserved for the promenade of the officers. At last the heavy breathing grew more and more irregular, and gradually dying away, left forever the unstirring form of Shenley. Calling the surgeon's steward, he at once told me to rouse the master-at-arms and 4 or 5 of my messmates. The master-at-arms approached and immediately demanded the dead man's back, which was accordingly dragged into the bay. Having been laid on the floor and washed with a bucket of water which I drew from the ocean, the body was then dressed in a white frock, trousers, and neckerchief, taken out of the bag. While this was going on, the master-at-arms, standing over the operation with his rotten, and directing myself and messmates, indulged in much discursive levity, intended to manifest his fearlessness of death. Pierre, who had been a chummy of Shenley's, spent much time in tying the neckerchief in an elaborate bow and affectionately adjusting the white frock and trousers, but the master-at-arms put an end to this by ordering us to carry the body up to the gun deck. It was placed on the death-board, used for that purpose, and we proceeded with it toward the main hatchway, awkwardly crawling under the tiers of hammocks when the entire watch below was sleeping. As unavoidably we rocked their pallets, the man-of-war's men would cry out against us. Through the mutterings of curses, the corpse reached the hatchway. Here the board slipped, and some time was spent in readjusting the body. At length we deposited it on the gun deck between 2 guns, and a Union Jack being thrown over it for a pall, I was left again to watch by its side. I had not been seated on my shot box 3 minutes when the messenger boy passed me on his way forward. Presently, the slow, regular stroke of the ship's great bell was heard, proclaiming through the calm the expiration of the watch. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. Poor Shenley, thought I, that sounds like your knell, and here you lie becalmed in the last calm of all. Hardly had the brazen din died away when the boatswain and his mates mustered round the hatchway within a yard or 2 of the corpse, and the usual thundering call was given for the watch below to turn out. All the starboard watch ahoy on the deck there below, wide awake their sleepers. But the dreamless sleeper by my side, who had so often sprung from his hammock at that summons, moved not a limb. The blue sheet over him lay unwrinkled. A messmate of the other watch now came to relieve me, but I told him I chose to remain where I was till daylight came. Chapter 80. The Last Stitch. Just before daybreak, 2 of the sailmaker's gang drew near, each with a lantern carrying some canvas, 2 large shot, needles, and twine. I knew their errand, for in men of war the sailmaker is the undertaker. They laid the body on deck, and after fitting the canvas to it, seated themselves cross-legged like tailors, 1 on each side, and with their lanterns before them went to stitching away as if mending an old sail. Both were old men, with grizzled hair and beard and shrunken faces. They belong to that small class of aged seamen, for their previous long and faithful services are retained in the Navy more as pensioners upon its merited bounty than anything else. They are set to light and easy duties. "Aren't this the foretop man, Shenley?" asked the foremost, looking full at the frozen face before him. "Aye, aye, old Ringrope," said the other, drawing his hand far back with a long thread. "I think it's him, and he's further aloft now, I hope, than ever he was at the foretruck. But I only hopes, I'm afeard this aren't the last on him. This hull here will be soon going out of sight below hatches, though, old Thrummings," replied Ringrope, placing 2 heavy cannonballs in the foot of the canvas shroud. "I don't know that, old man. I never yet sewed up a shipmate, but he spooked me arterward. I tell you, Ringrope, these here corpses is cunning. You think they sinks deep, but they comes up again as soon as he sails over 'em. They lose the number of their mess, and their messmates sticks the spoons in the rack. But no good, no good, old Ringrope, they aren't dead yet. I tell you now, 10 best bower anchors wouldn't sink this air top man. He'll soon be coming in the wake of the 39 spooks what spooks me every night in my hammock, just afore the mid-watch is called. Small thanks I gets for my pains, and every one of 'em looks so proachful like, with a sailmaker's needle through his nose. I've been thinking, old Ringrope, it's all wrong, that ere last stitch we takes. Depend on it, they don't like it, none on 'em." I was standing leaning over a gun, gazing at the 2 old men. The last remark reminded me of a superstitious custom generally practiced by most sea undertakers upon these occasions. I resolved that, if I could help it, I should not take place upon the remains of Shenley. "Thrummings," said I, advancing to the last speaker, "you are right. The last thing you do to the canvas is the very reason, be sure of it, that brings the ghosts after you, as you say. So don't do it to this poor fellow, I entreat. Try once now, how it goes not to do it." "What do you say to the youngster, old man?" says Thrummings, holding up his lantern into his comrade's wrinkled face, as if deciphering some ancient parchment. "I'm agin all innovations," said Ringrope. "It's a good old-fashioned, that last stitch. It keeps 'em snug, you see, youngster. I'm blessed if they could sleep sound. If it want for that. No, Thrummings, no innovations. I won't hear on it. It goes for the last stitch." "Suppose you was going to be sewed up yourself, old Ringrope. Would you like the last stitch then?" "You're an old gun, Ringrope. You can't stand looking out at your porthole much longer," said Thrummings, as his own palsied hands were quivering over the canvas. "Better say that to yourself, old man," replied Ringrope, stooping close to the light to thread his coarse needle, which trembled in his withered hands like the needle in a compass of a Greenland ship near the pole. "You ain't long for the sarvice. I wish I could give you some of the old blood in my veins, old man." "You ain't got ne'er a teaspoonful to spare," said Thrummings. "It will go hard, and I wouldn't want to do it, but I'm afeard I'll have the sewing up on you for long." "Sew me up, me dead and you alive, old man," shrieked Ringrope. "Well, I've heard the parson of the old Independence say as how old age was deceitful, but I never seed it was so true afore this blessed night. I'm sorry for you, old man, to see you so innocent-like, and the death all the while turning in and out with you in your hammock, for all the world like a hammock mate." "You lie, old man," cried Thrummings, shaking with rage. "It's you that have death for a hammock mate. It's you that will make a hole in the shot locker soon." "Take that back," cried Ringrope huskily, leaning far over the corpse, and needle in hand, menacing his companion with his aguish fist. "Take that back, or I'll throttle your lean bag o' wind for you." "Blast you, old chaps, ain't ye any more manners than to be fighting over a dead man?" cried one of the sailmaker's mates, coming down from the spar deck. Bear a hand, and get through with that job." "Only one more stitch to take," muttered Ringrope, creeping near the face. "Drop your palm then, and let Thrummings take it. Follow me. The foot of the mainsail wants mending. Must do it afore a breeze springs up. Do you hear, old chap? I say, drop your palm and follow me." At the reiterated command of his superior, Ringrope rose, and turning to his comrade said, "I take it all back, Thrummins, and I'm sorry for it too, but mind ye, take that ere last stitch now. If you don't, there's no tellin' the consequences." As the mate and his man departed, I stole up to Thrummings. "Don't do it. Don't do it now, Thrummings. Depend on it, it's wrong." "Well, youngster, I'll try this here one without it, for just this here once. And if arter that he don't spook me, I'll be dead again the last stitch as long as my name is Thrummings." So without mutilation, the remains were replaced between the guns, the Union Jack again thrown over them, and I reseated myself on the shot box. Chapter 81. How They Bury a Man-of-War's Man at Sea. Quarters over in the morning, the boatswain and his four mates stood round the main hatchway, and after giving the usual whistle, made the customary announcement, "All hands, bury the dead, ahoy!" In a man-of-war, everything, even to a man's funeral and burial, proceeds with the unrelenting promptitude of the martial code, and whether it is all hands bury the dead or all hands splice the main brace, the order is given in the same hoarse tones. Both officers and men assembled in the lee waist, and through that bareheaded crowd the messmates of Shenley brought his body to the same gangway where it had thrice winced under the scourge. But there's something in death that ennobles even a pauper's corpse, and the captain himself stood bareheaded before the remains of a man whom with his hat on he had sentenced to the ignominious gratings when alive. "I am the resurrection and the life," solemnly began the chaplain, in full canonicals, the prayer book in his hand. "Damn you, off those booms!" roared a boatswain's mate to a crowd of top men who had elevated themselves to gain a better view of the scene. "We commit this body to the deep." At the word, Shenley's messmates tilted the board and the dead sailor sank in the sea. "Look aloft," whispered Jack Chase. "See that bird? It is the spirit of Shenley." Gazing upward, all beheld a snow-white solitary fowl, which, whence coming no one could tell, had been hovering over the main mast during the service, and was now sailing far up into the depths of the sky. Chapter 82. What Remains of a Man-of-War's Man After His Burial at Sea. Upon examining Shenley's bag, a will was found, scratched in pencil upon a blank leaf in the middle of his Bible, or, to use the phrase of one of the seamen in the midships, atween the Bible and Testament, where the apothecary, apocrypha, used to be. The will was comprised in one solitary sentence, exclusive of the dates and signatures. "In case I die on the voyage, the purser will please pay over my wages to my wife, who lives in Portsmouth, New Hampshire." Besides the testators, there were two signatures of witnesses, the last will and testament being shown to the purser, who it seems had been a notary or surrogate of some sort of cozy chamber practitioner in the time. He declared that it must be proved, so the witnesses were called, and after recognizing their hands to the paper for the purpose of additionally testing their honesty, they were interrogated concerning the day on which they had signed, whether it was Banyan Day or Duff Day or Swamp Seed Day. For among the sailors on board a man-of-war, the land terms Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday are almost unknown. In place of these, they substitute nautical names, some of which are significant of the daily bill of fare dinner for the week. The two witnesses are somewhat puzzled by the attorney-like questions of the purser, till a third party came along, one of the ship's barbers, and declared of his own knowledge that Shenley executed the instrument on a shaven day, for the deceased seaman had informed him of the circumstance when he came to have his beard reaped on the morning of the event. In the purser's opinion, this settled the question, and it is to be hoped that the widow duly received her husband's death-earned wages. Shenley was dead and gone, and what was Shenley's epitaph? D.D. Opposite his name in the purser's book, in black's best writing fluid, funeral name and funeral hue, meaning discharged, dead. Chapter 83. A Man-of-War College. In our man-of-war world, life comes in at one gangway and death goes overboard at the other. Under the man-of-war's scourge, curses mix with tears, and the sigh and the sob furnish the bass to the shrill octave of those who laugh to drown buried griefs of their own. Checkers were played in the waist at the time of Shenley's burial, and as the body plunged, a player swept the board. The bubbles had hardly burst when all hands were piped down by the boatswain, and the old jests were heard again, as if Shenley himself were there to hear. This man-of-war life had not left me unheartened. I cannot stop to weep over Shenley now. That would be false to the life I depict. Wearing no mourning weeds, I resume the task of portraying our man-of-war world. Among the various other vocations, all driven abreast on board of the Neversink was that of the schoolmaster. There were 2 academies in the frigate. One comprised the apprentice boys, who upon certain days of the week were indoctrinated in the mysteries of the primer by an invalid corporal of Marines, a slender, wizen-cheeked man who had received a liberal infant school education. The other school was a far more pretentious affair, a sort of army and navy seminary combined, where mystical mathematical problems were solved by the midshipmen, and great ships of the line were navigated over imaginary shoals by unimaginable observations of the moon and stars, and learned lectures were delivered upon great guns, small arms, and the curvilinear lines described by bombs in the air. The professor was the title bestowed upon the erudite gentleman who conducted this seminary, and by that title alone he was known throughout the ship. He was domiciled in the wardroom and circulated there on a social par with the purser, surgeon, and other non-combatants and Quakers. By being advanced to the dignity of a peerage in the wardroom, science and learning were ennobled in the person of this professor. Even his dignity was honored in the chaplain enjoying the rank of a spiritual peer. Every other afternoon, while at sea, the professor assembled his pupils on the half-deck, near the long 24-pounders. A bass drumhead was his desk, his pupils forming a semicircle around him, seated on shot boxes and match tubs. They were in the jelly of youth, and this learned professor poured into their susceptible hearts all the gentle gunpowder maxims of war, presidents of peace societies and superintendents of Sabbath schools. Must it not have been a most interesting sight? But the professor himself was a noteworthy person, a tall, thin, spectacled man about 40 years old, with a student's stoop in his shoulders, and wearing uncommonly scanty pantaloons, exhibiting an undue proportion of his boots. In early life he had been a cadet in the military academy of West Point, but becoming very weak-sided and thereby in a good manner disqualified for active service in the field, he had declined entering the army and accepted the office of professor in the Navy. His studies at West Point had thoroughly grounded him in a knowledge of gunnery, and as he was not a little of a pedant, he was sometimes amusing, when the sailors were at quarters, to hear him criticize their evolutionaries at the batteries. He would quote Dr. Hutton's tracts on the subject, also in the original The French Bombardier, and wind up by Italian passages from the Pratica Manuel de Artilleria. Though not required by the Navy regulations to instruct his scholars in aught but the application of mathematics to navigation, yet besides this and besides instructing them in the theory of gunnery, he also sought to root them in the theory of frigate and fleet tactics. To be sure, he himself did not know how to splice a rope or furl a sail, and owing to his partiality for strong coffee, he was apt to be nervous when we fired salutes, yet all this did not prevent him from delivering lectures on cannonading and breaking the enemy's line. He arrived at his knowledge of tactics by silent solitary study and earnest meditation in the sequestered retreat of his stateroom. His case was somewhat parallel to the Scotchman's, John Clerk, Esquire of Eldon, who, though he had never been to sea, composed a quarto treatise on fleet fighting, which to this day remains a textbook, and he also originated a nautical maneuver, which was given to England many a victory over her foes. Now there was a large blackboard, something like a great gun target, only it was square, which during the professor's lectures was placed upright on the gun deck, supported behind by 3 boarding pikes. And he here would chalk out diagrams of great fleet engagements, making marks like the soles of shoes for the ships and drawing a dog vane in one corner to denote the assumed direction of the wind. This done with a cutlass, he would point out every spot of interest. Now, young gentlemen, the board before you exhibits the disposition of the British West Indian Squadron under Rodney, when, early on the morning of the 9th of April, in the year of our blessed Lord 1782, he discovered part of the French fleet, commanded by the Comte de Grasse, lying under the north end of the island of Dominica. It was at this juncture that the admiral gave the signal for the British line to prepare for battle and stand on. Do you understand, young gentlemen? Well, the British van having nearly fetched up with the center of the enemy, who, be it remembered, were then on the starboard tack, and Rodney's center and rear being yet becalmed under the lee of the land, the question I ask you is, what should Rodney now do? Blaze away by all means, responded a rather confident reefer, who had zealously been observing the diagram. But sir, his center and rear are still becalmed, and his van has not yet closed with the enemy. Wait till he does come in range and then blaze away, said the reefer. Permit me to remark, Mr. Perk, that blaze away is not a strictly technical term, and also permit me to hint, Mr. Pert, that you should consider the subject rather more deeply before you hurry forward your opinion. This rebuke not only abashed Mr. Pert, but for a time intimidated the rest, and the professor was obliged to proceed and extricate the British fleet by himself. He concluded by awarding Admiral Rodney the victory, which must have been exceedingly gratifying to the family pride of the surviving relatives and connections of that distinguished hero. "Shall I clean the board, sir?" now asked Mr. Pert, brightening up. "No, sir, not till you have saved that crippled French ship in the corner. That ship, young gentleman, is the Glorieuse. You perceive she is cut off from her consorts, and the whole British fleet is giving chase to her. Her bowsprit is gone, her rudder is torn away. She has 100 round shot in her hull, and 2/3 of her men are dead or dying. What's to be done, the wind being at northeast by north?" "Well, sir," said Mr. Dash, a chivalric young gentleman from Virginia, "I wouldn't strike yet. I'd nail my colors to the main royal mast. I would, by Jove." "And that would not save your ship, sir. Besides, your main mast has gone by the board." "I think, sir," said Mr. Slim, a diffident youth, "I think, sir, I would haul back the foretopsail." "And why so? Of what service would that be, I should like to know, Mr. Slim?" "I can't tell exactly, but I think it would help her a little," was the timid reply. "Not a whit, sir, not one particle. Besides, you can't haul back your foretopsail. Your foremast is lying across your forecastle." "Haul back the main topsail, then," suggested another. "Can't be done. Your mainmast also has gone by the board." "Mizzen topsail?" meekly suggested little boat plug. "Your mizzen topmast, let me inform you, sir, was shot down in the first of the fight." "Well, sir," cried Mr. Dash, "I'd tack ship anyway, bid 'em goodbye with a broadside, nail my flag to the keel if there was no other place, and blow my brains out on the poop." "Idle, idle, sir, worse than idle. You are carried away, Mr. Dash, by your ardent southern temperament. Let me inform you, young gentleman, that this ship," touching it with his cutlass, "cannot be saved." Then throwing down his cutlass, "Mr. Pert, have the goodness to hand me one of those cannonballs from the rack." Balancing the iron sphere in one hand, the learned professor began fingering it with the other, like Columbus illustrating the rotundity of the globe before the Royal Commission of Castilian ecclesiastics. "Young gentlemen, I resume my marks on the passage of a shot in Vacua, which remarks were interrupted yesterday by General Quarters. After quoting that admirable passage in Spearman's British Gunner, I then laid it down, you remember, that the path of a shot in vacuo describes a parabolic curve. I now add that, agreeably to the method pursued by the illustrious Newton in treating the subject of curvilinear motion, I consider the trajectory of curve described by a moving body in space as consisting of a series of right lines described in successive intervals of time, and constituting the diagonals of parallelograms, formed in a vertical plane between the vertical deflections caused by gravity and the production of the line of motion which has been described in each preceding interval of time. This must be obvious, for if you say that the passage in vacuo of this cannonball, now held in my hand, would describe otherwise than a series of right lines, etc., then you are brought to the reductio ad absurdum, that the diagonals of parallelograms are, "All hands reef topsail," was now thundered forth by the boatswain's mates. The shot fell from the professor's palm, his spectacles dropped on his nose, and the school tumultuously broke up, the pupils scrambling up the ladders with the sailors, who had been overhearing the lecture. Chapter 84. Man-of-War Barbers. The allusion to one of the ship's barbers in a previous chapter, together with the recollection of how conspicuous a part they enacted in a tragical drama soon to be related, leads me now to introduce them to the reader. Among the numerous artists and professors of polite trades in the Navy, none are held in higher estimation or drive a more profitable business than these barbers. And it may well be imagined that the 500 heads of hair and 500 beards of a frigate should furnish no small employment for those to whose faithful care they may be entrusted. As everything connected with the domestic affairs of a man of war comes under the supervision of the martial executive, so certain barbers are formally licensed by the first lieutenant. The better to attend to the profitable duties of their calling, they are exempted from all ship's duty except that of standing night watches at sea, mustering at quarters, and coming on deck when all hands are called. They are rated as able seamen or ordinary seamen and receive their wages as such, but in addition to this, they are liberally recompensed for their professional service. Herein, their rate of pay is fixed for every sailor manipulated, so much per quarter, which is charged to the sailor and credited to his barber on the books of the purser. It has been seen that while a man-of-war barber is shaving his customers at so much per chin, his wages as a seaman are still running on, which makes him a sort of sleeping partner of a sailor. Nor are the sailor wages he receives altogether to be reckoned as earnings. Considering the circumstances, however, not much objection can be made to the barbers on this score. But there were instances of men in the Neversink receiving government money in part pay for work done for private individuals. Among these were several accomplished tailors, who nearly the whole crew sat cross-legged on the half-deck, making coats, pantaloons, and vests for the quarter-deck officers. Some of these men, though knowing little or nothing about sailor duties and seldom or never performing them, stood upon the ship's books as ordinary seamen, entitled to $10 a month. And why was this? Previous to shipping, they had divulged the fact of their being tailors. True, the officers who employed them upon their wardrobes paid them for their work, but some of them in such a way as to elicit much grumbling from the tailors. At any rate, these makers and menders of clothes did not receive from some of these officers an amount equal to what they could have fairly gained ashore by doing the same work. It was a considerable saving to the officers to have their clothes made on board. The men belonging to the carpenter's gang furnished another case in point. There were some 6 or 8 allotted to this department. All the crews, they were hard at work. At what? Mostly making chests of drawers, canes, little ships and schooners, swifts, and other elaborated trifles, chiefly for the captain. What did the captain pay them for their trouble? Nothing. But the United States government paid them, 2 of them, the mates, at $19 a month, and the rest receiving the pay of able seamen, $12. To return, the regular days upon which the barbers shall exercise their vocation are set down on the ship's calendar, and known as shaving days. On board of the Neversink, these days are Wednesdays and Saturdays, when, immediately after breakfast, the barber shops were open to customers. They were in different parts of the gun deck, between the long 24-pounders. Their furniture, however, was not very elaborate, hardly equal to the sumptuous appointments of metropolitan barbers. Indeed, it merely consisted of a match tub, elevated upon a shop box as a barber's chair for the patient. No sight glasses, no hand mirror, no ear and basin, no comfortable padded footstool, nothing, in short, that makes a shore shave such a luxury. Nor are the implements of these man-of-war barbers out of keeping with the rude appearance of their shops. Their razors are of the simplest patterns, and, from their jaggedness, would seem better fit for the preparing and harrowing of the soil than for the ultimate reaping of the crop. But this is no matter for wonder, since so many chins are to be shaven, and a razor case holds but 2 razors. For only 2 razors does a man-of-war barber have, and like the marine sentries at the gangway and ports, these razors go off and on duty in rotation. 1 brush, 2 brushes every chin, and 1 lather lathers them all. No private brushes and boxes, no reservations whatever. As it would be altogether too much trouble for a man-of-war's man to keep his own shaving tools and shave himself at sea, and since therefore nearly the whole ship's company patronized the ship's barbers, and as the seamen must be shaven by evening quarters of the days appointed for the business, it may be readily imagined what a scene of bustle and confusion there is when the razors are being applied. First come, first serve is the motto, and often you have to wait for hours together, sticking to your position like one of the Indian file of merchants, clerks getting letters out of the post office. Here you have a chance to occupy the pedestal of the match tub. Often the crowd of quarrelsome candidates wrangle and fight for precedency, while at all times the interval is employed by the garrulous in every variety of ship gossip. As the shaving days are unalterable, they often fall upon days of high seas and tempestuous winds, when the vessel pitches and rolls in a frightful manner. In consequence, many valuable lives are jeopardized from the razor being plied under such untoward circumstances. But these sea barbers pride themselves upon their sea legs, and often you will see them standing over their patients with their feet wide apart and scientifically swaying their body to the motion of the ship as they flourish their edge tools about the lips, nostrils, and jugular. As I looked upon the practitioner and patient at such times, I could not help thinking that if the sailor had any insurance on his own life, it would certainly be deemed forfeited should the president of the company chance to lounge by and behold him in that imminent peril. For myself, I accounted it an excellent preparation for going into a sea fight, where fortitude in standing up to your gun and running the risk of all splinters comprise part of the practical qualities that make up an efficient man-of-war's man. It remains to be related that these barbers of ours had their labors considerably abridged by a fashion prevailing among many of the crew, of wearing very large whiskers, so that in most cases the only parts needing a shave were the upper lip and suburbs of the chin. This had been more or less the custom during the whole 3 years' cruise, but for some time previous to our weathering Cape Horn, very many of the seamen had redoubled their assiduity in cultivating their beards preparatory to their return to America. There they anticipated creating no small impression by their immense and magnificent homeward bounders, so they called the long fly brushes at their chins. In particular, the more aged sailors embracing the old guard of sea grenadiers on the forecastle, and the begrimed gunner's mates and quarter gunners, sported most venerable beards of an exceeding length and hoariness. like long trailing moss hanging from the bough of some aged oak. Above all, the captain of the forecastle, old Ushant, a fine specimen of a sea sexagenarian, wore a wide, spreading beard, gizzled and gray, that flowed over his breast and often became tangled and knotted with tar. This Ushant, in all weathers, was ever alert at his duty, intrepidly mounting the foreyard in a gale, his long beard streaming like Neptune's. Off Cape Horn it looked like a miller's, being all powdered with frost. Sometimes it glittered with minute icicles in the pale, cold, moonlit Patagonian nights. But though he was so active in time of tempest, yet when his duty did not call for exertion, he was remarkably staid, reserved, silent, and majestic old man, holding himself aloof from noisy revelry, and never participating in the boisterous sports of the crew. He resolutely set his beard against their boyish frolickings, and often held forth like an oracle concerning the vanity thereof. Indeed, at times he was wont to talk philosophy to his ancient companions, the old sheet-anchor men around him, as well as to the hare-brained tenants of the foretop and the giddy lads in the mizzen. Nor was his philosophy to be despised. It abounded in wisdom. For this Ushant was an old man, of strange natural sense, who'd seen nearly the whole terraqueous globe, and could reason of civilized and savage, of Gentile and Jew, of Christian and Muslim. The long night watches of the sailor are eminently adapted to draw out the reflective faculties of any serious-minded man, however humble or uneducated. Judge, then, what half a century of battling out watches on the ocean must have done for this fine old tar. It was a sort of a sea Socrates, in his old age, pouring out his last philosophy in life, as sweet Spenser has it. And I could never look at him and survey his right reverend beard without bestowing upon him that title which, in one of his satires, Persius gives to the immortal quafer of the hemlock, Magister Barbatus, the bearded master. Not a few of the ship's company had also bestowed great pains upon their hair, which some of them, especially the genteel young sailor bucks of the afterguard, wore over their shoulders like the ringleted cavaliers. Many sailors, with naturally tendril locks, prided themselves upon what they call love curls, worn at the side of the head just before the ear, a custom peculiar to tars, and which seems to have filled the vacated place of the old-fashioned Lord Rodney queue, which they used to wear some 50 years ago. But there were others of the crew laboring under the misfortune of long, lank Winnebago locks, carroty bunches of hair, or rebellious brustles of a sandy hue. Ambitious of redundant mops, these still suffered their carrots to grow, spite of all ridicule. They looked like Huns and Scandinavians, and one of them, a young down-easter, the unenvied proprietor of a thick crop of inflexible yellow bamboos, went by the name of Peter the Wild Boy. For like Peter the Wild Boy in France, it was supposed that he must have been caught like a catamount in the pine woods of Maine. But there were many fine flowing heads of hair to counterbalance such sorry exhibitions as Peter's, what with long whiskers and venerable beards, then of every variety of cut, Charles V's and Aurelians, and endless goatees and imperials, and what with abounding locks our crew seemed a company of Merovingians or long-haired kings, mixed with savage Lombards or Longobardi, so called from their lengthy beards. Chapter 85, The Great Massacre of the Beards. The preceding chapter fitly paves the way for the present, wherein it sadly befalls White Jacket to chronicle a calamitous event, which filled the Neversink with long lamentations that echo through all her decks and tops. After dwelling upon our redundant locks and thrice noble beards, fain would I cease and let the sequel remain undisclosed, truth and fidelity forbid. As I now deviously hover and lingeringly skirmish about the frontiers of this melancholy recital, a feeling of sadness comes over me that I cannot withstand. Such a heartless massacre of hair, such a Bartholomew's Day and Sicilian Vespers of assassinated beards. Ah, who would believe it? With intuitive sympathy I feel my own brown beard while I write, and thank my kind stars that each precious hair is forever beyond the reach of the ruthless barbers of a man of war. It needs that this sad and most serious matter should be faithfully detailed. Throughout the cruise, many of the officers had expressed their abhorrence of the impunity with which the most extensive plantations of hair were cultivated under their very noses, and they frowned upon every beard with even greater dislike. They said it was unseamanlike, not shipshape, in short. It was disgraceful to the Navy. But as Captain Claret said nothing, and the officers of themselves had no authority to preach a crusade against whiskerandos, the old guard of the forecastle still complacently stroked their beards, and the sweet youths of the afterguard still lovingly threaded their fingers through their curls. Perhaps the captain's generosity in thus far permitting our beards sprung from the fact that he himself wore a small speck of a beard upon his own imperial cheek, which, if rumor said true, was to hide something, as Plutarch relates of the Emperor Adrian. But to do him justice, as I have always done, the captain's beard did not exceed the limits prescribed by the Navy Department. According to a then recent ordinance at Washington, the beards of both officers and seamen were to be accurately laid out and surveyed, and on no account must come lower than the mouth, so as to correspond with the Army standard. A regulation directly opposed to the theocratical law laid down in the 19th chapter and 27th verse of Leviticus, where it expressly ordained, "Thou shalt not mar the corners of thy beard." But legislators do not always square their statutes by those of the Bible. At last, when we crossed the northern tropic and were standing up to our guns at evening quarters, and when the setting sun streaming in at the portholes lit up every hair, till to an observer on the quarterdeck 2 long even lines of beards seemed one dense grove, in that evil hour it must have been that a cruel thought entered the heart of our captain. "A pretty set of savages," thought he, "am I taking home to America? People will think them all catamounts and Turks. Besides, now that I think of it, it's against the law. It will never do. They must be shaven and shorn, that's flat." There's no knowing, indeed, whether these were the very words in which the captains meditated that night, for it is yet a mooted point among metaphysicians, whether we think in words or whether we think in thoughts. But something like the above must have been the captain's cogitations. At any rate, that very evening the ship's company were astounded by an extraordinary announcement made at the main hatchway of the gun deck by the boatswain's mate there stationed. He was afterwards discovered to have been tipsy at the time. "Do you hear there, fore and aft? All you that have hair on your heads, shave them off, and all you that have beards, trim them small. Shave off our Christian heads, and then placing them between our knees, trim small our worship beards?" The captain was mad. But directly the boatswain came rushing to the hatchway, and after soundly rating his tipsy mate, thundered forth the true version of the order that had issued from the quarterdeck. As amended, it ran thus: "Do you hear there, fore and aft? All you that have long hair, cut it short, and all you that have large whiskers, trim them down according to the Navy regulations." This was an amendment, to be sure, but what barbarity, after all! What, not 30 days run from home and lose our magnificent homeward bounders? The homeward bounders we had been cultivating so long, lose them at one fell swoop. Were the vile barbers of the gun deck to reap our long nodding harvests and expose our innocent chins to the chill air of the Yankee coasts, and our viny locks, were they also to be shorn? Was a grand sheep shearing, such as they annually have at Nantucket, to take place, and our ignoble barbers to carry off the fleece? Captain Claret, in cutting our beards and our hair, you cut us the unkindest cut of all. Were we going into action, Captain Claret, going to fight the foe with our hearts of flame and our arms of steel, then will we gladly offer up our beards to the terrific god of war, and that we would account but a wise precaution against having them tweaked by the foe. Then, Captain Claret, you will but be imitating the example of Alexander, who had his Macedonians all shaven, that in the hour of battle their beards might not be handles to the Persians. But now, Captain Claret, when after our long cruise we are returning to our homes, tenderly stroking the fine tassels on our chins, and thinking of father or mother or sister or brother, or daughter or son, to cut off our beards now, the very beards that were frosted white off the pitch of Patagonia. This is too bitterly bad, Captain Claret, and by heaven we will not submit. Train your guns inboard. Let the marines fix their bayonets. Let the officers draw their swords. We will not let our beards be reaped, the last insult inflicted upon a vanquished foe in the east. Where are you, sheet anchor men, captains of the tops, gunners' mates, mariners, all? Muster round the capstan your venerable beards, and while you braid them together in token of brotherhood, cross hands and swear that we will enact over again the mutiny of the Nore, and sooner perish than yield up a hair. The excitement was intense throughout that whole evening. Groups of 10s and 20s were scattered about the decks, discussing the mandate and inveighing against its barbarous author. The long area of the gun deck was something like a populous street of brokers, when some terrible commercial tidings have newly arrived. One and all they resolved not to succumb, and every man swore to stand by his beard and his neighbor. 24 hours after, at the next evening quarters, the captain's eye was observed to wander along the men at their guns. Not a beard was shaven. When the drum beat the retreat, the boatswain, now attended by all 4 of his mates to give additional solemnity to the announcement, repeated the previous day's order and concluded by saying that 24 hours would be given for all to acquiesce. But the second day passed, and at quarters, untouched, every beard bristled on its chin. Forthwith, Captain Claret summoned the midshipmen, who, receiving his orders, hurried to the various divisions of the guns, and communicated them to the lieutenants respectively stationed over divisions. The officer commanding mine turned upon us and said, "Men, if tomorrow night I find any of you with long hair or whiskers of a standard violating the Navy regulations, the names of such offenders shall be put down on the report." The affair had now assumed a most serious aspect. The captain was in earnest. The excitement increased tenfold, and a great many of the older seamen, exasperated to the uttermost, talked about knocking off duty till the obnoxious mandate was revoked. I thought it impossible that they would seriously think of such a folly, but there is no knowing what man-of-war's men will sometimes do under provocation. Witness Parker and the Nore. That same night, when the first watch was set, the men in a body drove the two boatswains' mates from their stations at the fore and main hatchways, and unshipped the ladders, thus cutting off all communication between the gun and spar decks, forward of the mainmast. Mad Jack had the trumpet, and no sooner was this incipient mutiny reported to him than he jumped right down among the mob, and fearlessly mingling with them exclaimed, "What do you mean, men? Don't be fools. This is no way to get what you want. Turn to, my lads, turn to. Boatswain's mates, ship that ladder. So, up you tumble. Now, my hearties, away you go." His gallant, off-handed, confident manner, recognizing no attempt at mutiny, operated upon the sailors like magic. They tumbled up as commanded, and for the rest of that night contented themselves with privately fulminating their displeasure against the captain, and publicly emblazoning every anchor button on the coat of admired Mad Jack. Captain Claret happened to be taking a nap in his cabin at the moment of the disturbance, and it was quelled so soon that he knew nothing of it, till it was officially reported to him. It was afterward rumored through the ship that he reprimanded Mad Jack for acting as he did. He maintained that he should have at once summoned the Marines and charged upon the mutineers, but if the sayings imputed to the captain were true, he nevertheless refrained from subsequently noticing the disturbance, or attempting to seek out and punish the ringleaders. This was but wise, for there are times when even the most potent governor must wink at transgression in order to preserve the laws inviolate for the future. And great care is to be taken by timely management to avert an incontestable act of mutiny, and so prevent men from being roused by their own consciousness of transgression into all the fury of an unbounded insurrection. Then for the time both soldiers and sailors are irresistible, as even the valor of Caesar was made to know, and the prudence of Germanicus, when their legions rebelled, and not all the concessions of Earl Spencer, the first lord of the Admiralty, nor the treats and entreaties of Lord Bridport, and the admiral of the fleet, no, nor his gracious majesty's plenary pardon and prospective, could prevail upon the spithead mutineers, when at last fairly lashed up to the mark, to succumb until deserted by their own messmates, and a handful was left in the breach. Therefore, Mad Jack, you did right, and no one else could have acquitted himself better, by your crafty simplicity, good-natured daring, and off-handed air. As if nothing was happening, you perhaps quelled a very serious affair in the bud, and prevented the disgrace to the American Navy of a tragical mutiny growing out of whiskers, soapsuds, and razors. Think of it, if future historians should devote a long chapter to the great rebellion of the beards on board of the United States ship Neversink, why, through all time hereafter, barbers would cut down their spiralized poles and substitute miniature mainmasts for the emblems of their calling. And here is an ample scope for some pregnant instruction, how that events of vast magnitude in our man-of-war world may originate in the pettiest of trifles. But that is an old theme, we waive it and proceed. On the morning following, though it was not a regular shaving day, the gun-deck barbers were observed to have their shops open, their match-tub accommodations in readiness, and their razors displayed. With their brushes raising a mighty lather in their tin pots, they stood eyeing the passing throng of seamen, silently inviting them to walk in and be served. In addition to their usual implements, they now flourished at long intervals a huge pair of sheep shears, by way of more forcibly reminding the men of the edict which that day must be obeyed, or woe betide them. For some hours the seamen paced to and fro in no very good humor, vowing not to sacrifice a hair. Before, they denounced that man who should abase himself by compliance. But habituation to discipline is magical, and ere long an old forecastle man was discovered elevated upon a match-tub, while with a malicious grin his barber, a fellow who from his merciless rasping was called Blueskin, seized him by his long beard and at one fell stroke cut it off and tossed it out of the porthole behind him. This forecastle man was ever afterwards known by a significant title, and the main equivalent to the name of reproach fastened upon that Athenian who, in Alexander's time, previous to which all the Greeks sported beards, first submitted to the deprivation of his own. But spite of all the contempt hurled on our forecastle man, so prudent an example was soon followed. Presently all the barbers were busy. Sad sight, at which anyone but a barber or a Tartar would have wept. Beards 3 years old, goatees, would have graced a chamois of the Alps. imperials that Count d'Orsay would have envied, and love curls and a man-of-war ringlets that would have measured inch for inch with the longest tresses of the fair one with the golden locks, all went by the board. Captain Claret, how can you rest in your hammock, by this brown beard which now waves from my chin, the illustrious successor to that first young, vigorous beard I yielded to your tyranny? By this manly beard I swear it was barbarous. My noble Captain Jack Chase was indignant. Not even all the special favors he had received from Captain Claret, and the plenary pardon extended to him for his desertion in the Peruvian service, could restrain the expression of his feelings. But in his cooler moments Jack was a wise man, and at last he deemed it but wisdom to succumb. When he went to the barber, he almost drew tears from his eyes. Seating himself mournfully on the match tub, he looked sideways, and said to the barber, who was slithering his sheep shears in readiness to begin, "My friend, I trust your scissors are consecrated. Let them not touch this beard if they have not been dipped in holy water. Beards are sacred things, barber. Have you new feelings for beards, my friend? Think of it." And mournfully, he laid his deep-dyed, russet cheek upon his hand. 2 summers have gone by since my chin has been reaped. I was in Coquimbo then, on the Spanish Main, and when the husbandman was sowing his autumnal grain on the Viga, I started this blessed beard. And when the vine dressers were trimming their vines in the vineyards, I first trimmed it to the sound of a flute. Ah, barber, have you no heart? This beard has been caressed by the snow-white hand of a lovely Tomasita of Tombez, the Castilian belle of all lower Peru. Think of that, barber. I have worn it as an officer on the quarterdeck of a Peruvian man-of-war. I have sported it at brilliant fandangos in Lima. I have been alow and aloft with it at sea. Yeah, barber, it has streamed like an admiral's pennant at the masthead of this same gallant frigate, the Neversink. Oh, barber, barber, it stabs me to the heart. Talk not of hauling down your ensigns and standards when vanquished. What is that, barber? To striking that flag that nature herself has nailed to the mast. Here, noble Jack's feelings overcame him. He dropped from the animated attitude into which his enthusiasm had momentarily transported him. His proud head sunk upon his chest, and his long, sad beard almost grazed the deck. "Aye, trail your beards in grief and dishonor, O crew of the Neversink," sighed Jack. "Barber, come closer. Now tell me, my friend, have you obtained absolution for this deed you are about to commit? Have you not? Then, barber, I will absolve you. Your hands shall be washed of this sin. It is not you, but another. And though you are about to shear off my manhood, yet, barber, I freely forgive you. Kneel, kneel, barber, that I may bless you, in token that I cherish no malice." So when this barber, who was the only tender-hearted one of his tribe, had kneeled, been absolved, and then blessed, Jack gave up his beard into his hands, and the barber, clipping it off with a sigh, held it high aloft, and parodying the style of the boatswain's mate, cried aloud, "D'ye hear, fore and aft? This is the beard of our matchless Jack Chase, the noble captain of the frigate's maintop." Chapter 86. The Rebels Brought to the Mast. Though many heads of hair were shorn and many fine beards reaped that day, yet several still held out and vowed to defend their sacred hair to the last gasp of their breath. These were chiefly old sailors, some of them petty officers, who, presuming upon their age or rank, doubtless thought that after so many had complied with the captain's commands, they, being but a handful, would be exempted from compliance, and remained a monument of our master's clemency. That same evening, when the drums beat to quarters, the sailors went sullenly to their guns, and the old tars who still sported their beards stood up grim, defying, and motionless as the rows of sculptured Assyrian kings, who with their magnificent beards have recently been exhumed by Layard. When the proper time arrived, their names were taken down by the officers of divisions, and they were afterwards summoned in a body to the mast, where the captain stood ready to receive them. The whole ship's company crowded to the spot, and amid the breathless multitude, the venerable rebels advanced and unhatted. It was an imposing display. They were old and venerable mariners. Their cheeks had been burned brown in all latitudes, whenever the sun sends a tropical ray. Reverend old tars, one and all, some of them might have been grandsires, with grandchildren, in every port of the world. They ought to have commanded the veneration of the most frivolous or magisterial beholder. Even Captain Claret they ought to have humiliated into deference. But a Scythian is touched with no reverential promptings, and as the Roman student well knows, the august senators themselves, seated in the Senate House on the majestic hill of the Capitol, had their holy beards tweaked by the insolent chief of the Goths. Such an array of beards, spade-shaped, hammer-shaped, dagger-shaped, triangular, square, peaked, round, hemispherical, and forked. But chief among them all was old Yshants, the ancient captain of the forecastle. Of a Gothic venerableness, it fell upon his breast like a continual iron-grey storm. Ah, old Yshant, Nestor of the crew, it promoted my longevity to behold you. He was a man-of-war's-man of the old Benbow school. He wore a short queue, which the wags of the mizzen-top called his plug of pigtail. About his waist was a broad boarder's belt, which he wore, he said, to brace his main mast, meaning his backbone. For at times he complained of rheumatic twinges in the spine, consequent upon sleeping on deck, now and then during the night watches of upward of half a century. His sheath knife was an antique, a sort of old-fashioned pruning hook. Its handle, a sperm whale's tooth, was carved all over with ships, cannons, and anchors. It was attached to his neck by a lanyard, elaborately worked into rose knots, and Turk's heads by his own venerable fingers. Of all the crew, this Ushant was most beloved by my glorious captain, Jack Chase, who one day pointed him out to me as the old man was slowly coming down the rigging from the foretop. There, White Jacket, isn't that old Chaucer's shipman? A dagger hanging by a lass had he, about his neck under his arm adown. The hot summer had his beard made all brown. Hardy he is and wise, I undertake, with many a tempest has his beard beshake. From the Canterbury Tales, White Jacket, and must not old Ushant had been living in Chaucer's time, that Chaucer could draw his portrait so well? Chapter 87, Old Ushant at the Gangway. The rebel beards, headed by old Ushant, streaming like a commodore's bougie, now stood in silence at the mast. "You knew the order," said the captain, eyeing them severely. "What does that hair on your chins?" "Sir," said the captain of the forecastle, "did old Ushant ever refuse doing his duty? Did he ever yet miss his muster? But, sir, old Ushant's beard is his own." "What's that, sir?" "Master-at-arms, put that man into the brig." "Sir," said the old man respectively, "the 3 years for which I shipped are expired, and though I am perhaps bound to work the ship home, yet as matters are, I think my beard might be allowed me. It is but a few days, Captain Claret." "Put him into the brig," cried the captain. "And now, you old rascals," he added, turning round upon the rest, "I give you 15 minutes to have those beards taken off. If they then remain on your chins, I'll flog you, every mother's son of you, though you were all my own godfathers." The band of beards went forward, summoned their barbers, and their glorious pennants were no more. In obedience to orders, they then paraded themselves at the mast, and addressing the captain said, "Sir, our muzzle lashings are cast off." Nor is it unworthy of being chronicled that not a single sailor who complied with the general order but refused to sport the vile regulation whiskers prescribed by the Navy Department. No, like heroes, they cried, "Shave me clean! I will not wear a hair, since I cannot wear all." On the morrow, after breakfast, Ushant was taken out of irons, and with the master-at-arms at one side and an armed sentry on the other, was escorted along the gun deck and up the ladder to the main mast. There the captain stood firm as before. They must have guarded the old man thus to prevent his escape to the shore, something less than 1,000 miles distant at the time. "Well, sir, will you have that beard taken off? You have slept over it a whole night now. What do you say? I don't want to flog an old man like you, Ushant." "My beard is my own, sir," said the man lowly. "Will you take it off?" "It is mine, sir," said the old man tremulously. "Rig the gratings," roared the captain. "Master-at-arms, strip him. Quartermasters, seize him up. Boatswain's mates, do your duty." While these executioners were employed, the captain's excitement had a little time to abate, and when at last old Ushant was tied up by the arms and legs and his venerable back was exposed, that back which had bowed at the guns of the frigid Constitution when she captured the Guerrera, the captain seemed to relent. "You are a very old man," he said, "and I am sorry to flog you, but my orders must be obeyed. I will give you one more chance. Will you have that beard taken off?" "Captain Claret," said the old man, turning round painfully in his bonds, "you may flog me if you will, sir. But, sir, in this one thing I cannot obey you." "Lay on, I'll see his backbone," roared the captain in a sudden fury. "By heaven," thrillingly whispered Jack Chase, who stood by, "it's only a halter, I'll strike him." "Better not," said a top mate. "It's death or worse punishment, remember." "There goes the lash," cried Jack. "Look at the old man. By God, I can't stand it. Let me go, men." And with moist eyes, Jack forced his way to one side. "You, boatswain's mate," cried the captain, "you are favoring that man. Lay on soundly, sir, or I'll have your own cat laid soundly on you." 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 lashes were laid on the back of that heroic old man. He only bowed over his head and stood as the dying gladiator lies. "Cut him down," said the captain. "And now go and cut your own throat," hoarsely whispered an old sheet-anchor man, a messmate of Ushant's. When the master-at-arms advanced to the prisoner's shirt, Ushant waved him off with the dignified air of a Braham, saying, "Do you think, master-at-arms, that I am hurt? I will put on my own garment. I'm never the worse for it, man, and 'tis no dishonor, when he who would dishonor you only dishonors himself." "What says he?" cried the captain. "What says that tarry old philosopher with the smoking back? Tell it to me, sir, if you dare. Sentry, take that man back to the brig. Stop, John Ushant, you have been captain of the forecastle. I break you. And now you go into the brig, there to remain till you consent to have that beard taken off." "My beard is my own," said the old man quietly. "Sentry, I'm ready." And back he went into durance between the guns, but after lying some 4 or 5 days in iron, an order came to remove them, but he was still kept confined. Books were allowed him, and he spent much time in reading, but he also spent many hours in braiding his beard, and interweaving with it strips of red bunting, as if he desired to dress it and adorn the thing which had triumphed over all opposition. He remained a prisoner till we arrived in America, but the very moment he heard the chain rattle out of the hawse hole and the ship swing to her anchor, he started to his feet, dashed the sentry aside, and gaining the deck, exclaimed, "At home with my beard!" His term of service having some months previous expired, and the ship being now in harbor, he was beyond the reach of naval law, and the officers durst not molest him. But without unduly availing himself of these circumstances, the old man merely got his bag and hammock together, hired a boat, and throwing himself into the stern, was rowed ashore, amid the unsuppressible cheers of all hands. It was a glorious conquest over the conqueror himself, as well worthy to be celebrated as the Battle of the Nile. Though, as I soon afterward learned, Ushant was earnestly entreated to put the case into some lawyer's hands, he firmly declined, saying, "I have won the battle, my friends, and I do not care for the prize money." But even had he complied with these entreaties, from precedents in similar cases, it is almost certain that not a sou's worth of satisfaction would have been received. "I know not in what frigate you sail now, old Ushant, but heaven protect your storied old beard in whatever typhoon it may blow. And if it ever must be shorn, old man, may it fare like the royal beard of Henry the First of England, and be clipped by the right reverend hand of some archbishop of seas. As for Captain Claret, let it not be supposed that it is here sought to impale him before the world as a cruel, black-hearted man. Such he was not, nor was he upon the whole regarded by his crew with anything like the feelings with which a man-of-war's men sometimes cherish towards signally tyrannical commanders. In truth, the majority of the Neversink's crew, in previous cruises habituated to flagrant misusage, deemed Captain Claret a lenient officer. In many things he certainly refrained from oppressing them. It has been related what privileges he accorded to the seamen respecting the free playing of checkers, a thing almost unheard of in most American men of war. In the matter of overseeing the men's clothing also, he was remarkably indulgent, compared with the conduct of other Navy captains, who by sumptuary regulations obliged their sailors to run up large bills with the purser for clothes. In a word, of whatever acts Captain Claret might have been guilty in the Neversink, perhaps none of them proceeded from any personal, organic hard-heartedness. What he was, the usages of the Navy had made him. Had he been a mere landsman, a merchant, say, he would have no doubt been considered a kind-hearted man. There may be some who shall read of this Bartholomew massacre of beards, who will yet marvel, perhaps, that the loss of a few hairs, more or less, should provoke such hostility from the sailors, lash them into so frothing a rage, indeed come near breeding a mutiny. But these circumstances are not without precedent, not to speak of the riots attended with the loss of life which once occurred in Madrid in resistance to an arbitrary edict of the king's, seeking to suppress the cloak of the cavaliers. And not to make mention of other instances that might be quoted, it needs only to point out the rage of the Saxons in the time of William the Conqueror, when that despot commanded the hair on the upper lips to be shaven off, the hereditary mustaches which whole generations had sported. The multitude of the dispirited vanquished were obliged to acquiesce, but many Saxon franklins and gentlemen of spirit, choosing rather to lose their castles than their mustaches, voluntarily deserted their firesides and went into exile. All this is indignantly related by the stout Saxon friar Matthew Paris in his Historia Major, beginning with the Norman Conquest. And that our man-of-war's men were right in desiring to perpetuate their beards as martial appurtenances must seem very plain when it is considered that as the beard is the token of manhood, so in some shape or other, has it ever been held the true badge of a warrior. Bonaparte's grenadiers were stout whiskerandos, and perhaps, in a charge, those fierce whiskers of theirs did as much to appall the foe as the sheen of their bayonets. Most all fighting creatures sport either whiskers or beards. It seems a law of Dame Nature. Witness the boar, the tiger, the cougar, man, the leopard, the ram, the cat, all warriors and all whiskerandos. whereas the peace-loving tribes have mostly enameled chins. Chapter 88. Flogging through the Fleet. The flogging of an old man like Ushant most landsmen will probably regard with abhorrence, but though from peculiar circumstances, his case occasioned a good deal of indignation among the people of the Nethersink. Yet, upon its own proper grounds, they did not denounce it. Man-of-war's men are so habituated to what landsmen would deem excessive cruelties that they are almost reconciled to inferior severities. And here, though the subject of punishment in the Navy has been canvassed in previous chapters, and though the thing is every way a most unpleasant and grievous one to enlarge upon, and though I painfully nerve myself to it while I write, a feeling of duty compels me to enter upon a branch of the subject till now undiscussed. I would not be like the man who, seeing an outcast perishing by the roadside, turned about to his friends, saying, "Let us cross the way. My soul so sickens at this sight that I cannot endure it." There are certain enormities of this man-of-war world that often secure impunity by their very excessiveness. Some ignorant people will refrain from permanently removing the cause of a deadly malaria for fear of the temporary spread of its offensiveness. Let us not be of such. The more repugnant and repelling, the greater the evil. Leaving our women and children behind, let us freely enter this Golgotha. Years ago, there was a punishment inflicted in the English, and I believe in the American Navy, called keel-hauling. A phrase still employed by a man-of-war's men when they would express some signal vengeance upon a personal foe. The practice still remains in the French National Marine, though it is by no means resorted to so frequently as in times past. It consists of attaching tackles to the two extremities of the mainyard, and passing the rope under the ship's bottom. To one end of this rope the culprit is secured. His own shipmates are then made to run him up and down, first on this side, then on that, now scraping the ship's hull under water, anon hoisted, stunned, and breathless into the air. But though this barbarity is now abolished from the English and American navies, there still remains another practice, which, if anything, is even worse than keel-hogging. This remnant of the Middle Ages is known in the Navy as flogging through the fleet. It is never inflicted except by authority of a court-martial upon some trespasser deemed guilty of a flagrant offense. Never that I know of has it been inflicted by an American man-of-war on the home station. The reason probably is that the officers well know that such a spectacle would raise a mob in any American seaport. By the 41st of the Articles of War, a court-martial shall not, for any one offense not capital, inflict a punishment beyond 100 lashes. In cases not capital, this law may be, and has been, quoted in judicial justification of the infliction of more than 100 lashes. Indeed, it would cover 1,000. Thus, one act of a sailor may be construed into the commission of 10 different transgressions, for each of which he may legally be condemned to 100 lashes, to be inflicted without intermission. It will be perceived that in any case deemed capital, a sailor under the above article may legally be flogged to death. But neither by the Articles of War nor by any other enactment of Congress is there any direct warrant for the extraordinary cruelty of the mode in which punishment is inflicted in cases of flogging through the fleet. But as in numerous other instances, the incidental aggravations of this penalty are indirectly covered by other clauses in the Articles of War, one of which authorizes the authorities of a ship, in certain indefinite cases, to correct the guilty, according to the usages of the sea service. One of these usages is the following: all hands being called to witness punishment in the ship to which the culprit belongs, the sentence of the court-martial condemning him is read, when, with the usual solemnities, a portion of the punishment is inflicted, in order that it shall not lose in severity by the slightest exhaustion in the arm of the executioner. A fresh boatswain's mate is called out at every dozen. As the leading idea is to strike terror into the beholders, the greatest number of lashes is inflicted on board the culprit's own ship, in order to render him the more shocking spectacle to the crews of the other vessels. The first infliction being concluded, the culprit's shirt is thrown over him. He is put into a boat, the rogue's march is being played meanwhile, and rowed to the next ship of the squadron. All hands of that ship are then called to man the rigging, and another portion of the punishment is inflicted by the boatswain's mates of that ship. The bloody shirt is again thrown over the seaman, and thus he is carried through the fleet or squadron till the whole sentence is inflicted. In other cases, the launch, the largest of the boats, is rigged with a platform, like a headsman's scaffold, upon which halberds, something like those used in the English army, are erected. They consist of 2 stout poles planted upright. Upon the platform stand a lieutenant, a surgeon, a master-at-arms, and the executioner with their cats. They are rowed through the fleets, stopping at each ship till the whole sentence is inflicted as before. In some cases, the attending surgeon has professionally interfered before the last lash has been given, alleging that immediate death must ensue if the remainder should be administered without a respite. But instead of humanely remitting the remaining lashes, in a case like this, the man is generally consigned to his cot for 10 or 12 days, and when the surgeon officially reports him capable of undergoing the rest of the sentence, it is forthwith inflicted. Shylock must have had his pound of flesh. To say that after being flogged through the fleet, the prisoner's back is sometimes puffed up like a pillow, or to say that in other cases it looked as if burned black before a roasting fire, or to say that you may track him through the squadron by the blood on the bulwarks of every ship, would only be saying what many seamen have seen. Several weeks, sometimes whole months, elapse before the sailor is sufficiently recovered to resume his duties. During the greater part of that interval, he lies in the sick bay, groaning out his days and nights, and unless he has the hide and constitution of a rhinoceros, he never is the man he was before, but, broken and shattered to the marrow of his bones, sinks into death before his time. Instances have occurred where he has expired the day after the punishment. No wonder what the Englishman, Dr. Granville, himself once a surgeon in the Navy, declares in his work on Russia that the barbarian knout itself is not a greater torture to undergo than the Navy cat o' nine tails. Some years ago, a fire broke out near the powder magazine in an American national ship, one of the squadron at anchor in the Bay of Naples. The utmost alarm prevailed. A cry went fore and aft that the ship was about to blow up. One of the seamen sprang overboard in a fright. At length, the fire was got under, and the man was picked up. He was tried before a court-martial, found guilty of cowardice, and condemned to be flogged through the fleet. In due time, the squadron made sail for Algiers, and in that harbor, once haunted by pirates, the punishment was inflicted. The Bay of Naples, though washing the shores of an absolute king, not being deemed a fit place for such an exhibition of American naval law. While the Neversink was in the Pacific, an American sailor who had deposited a vote for General Harrison for the President of the United States was flogged through the fleet. Chapter 89. The Social State in a Man of War. Burr the floggings at the gangway and the floggings through the fleet, the stealings, highway robberies, swearings, gamblings, blasphemings, thimble riggings, smugglings, and tipplings of a man of war, which throughout this narrative have been here and there sketched from the life, by no means comprise the whole catalogue of evil. One single feature is full of significance. All large ships of war carry soldiers called marines. In the Neversink there was something less than 50. 2/3 of whom were Irishmen. They were officered by a lieutenant, an orderly sergeant, 2 sergeants, and 2 corporals, with a drummer and a fifer. The custom generally is to have a marine to each gun, which rule usually furnishes the scale for distributing the soldiers and vessels of different force. Our marines had no other than martial duty to perform, excepting that at sea they stood watches like the sailors, and now and then lazily assisted in pulling the ropes, but they never put foot in rigging or hand in tar bucket. On the quarter bills, these men were stationed at none of the great guns. On the station bills, they had no post at the ropes. What then were they for? To serve their country in time of battle? Let us see. When a ship is running into action, her marines generally lie flat on their faces behind the bulwarks. The sailors are sometimes ordered to do the same. And when the vessel is fairly engaged, they are usually drawn up in the ship's waist, like a company reviewing in the park. At close quarters, their muskets may pick off a seaman or two in the rigging. But at long gun distance, they must passively stand in their ranks and be decimated at the enemy's leisure. Only in one case in 10, that is, when their vessel is attempted to be boarded by a large party, are these marines of any essential service as fighting men. With their bayonets, they are then called upon to repel. If comparatively so useless as soldiers, then why have marines at all in the Navy? Know then that what standing armies are to nations, what turnkeys are to jails, these marines are to the seamen and all large men of war. Their muskets are their keys. With those muskets they stand guard over the fresh water, over the grog when doled, over the provisions when being served out by the master's mates, over the brig or jail at the commodore's and captain's cabin doors, and in port at both gangways and forecastle. Surely the crowd of sailors who, besides having so many sea officers over them, are thus additionally guarded by soldiers, even when they quench their thirst. Surely these men of war's men must be desperadoes indeed, or else the naval service must be so tyrannical that the worst is feared from their possible insubordination. Either reason holds good, or both, according to the character of the officers and crew. It must be evident that the man of war's man casts but an evil eye on a marine. To call a man a horse marine is, among seamen, one of the greatest terms of contempt. But the mutual contempt and even hatred subsisting between these two bodies of men, both clinging to one keel, both lodged in one household, is held by most Navy officers as the height of the perfection of Navy discipline. It is regarded as the button that caps the uttermost point of their mainmast. Thus they reason, secure of the antagonism between the Marine and the sailor, we can always rely upon it, that if the sailor mutinies, it needs no great incitement for the Marine to thrust his bayonet through his heart. If the Marine revolts, the pike of the sailor is impatient to charge. Checks and balances, blood against blood, that is the cry and the argument. What applies to the relation in which the Marine and sailor stand toward each other, the mutual repulsion implied by a system of checks, will, in degree, apply to nearly the entire interior of a man-of-war's discipline. The whole body of this discipline is emphatically a system of cruel cogs and wheels, systematically grinding up in one common hopper all that might minister to the moral well-being of the crew. It is the same with both officers and men. If a captain have a grudge against a lieutenant, or a lieutenant against a midshipman, how easy to torture him by official treatment, which shall not lay open the superior officer to legal rebuke. And if a midshipman bears a grudge against a sailor, how easy for him, by cunning practices, born of a boyish spite, to have him degraded at the gangway. Through all the endless ramifications of rank and station, in most men of war there runs a sinister vein of bitterness, not exceeded by the fireside hatreds in a family of stepsons ashore. It were sickening to detail all the paltry irritabilities, jealousies, and cabals, the spiteful detractions and animosities that lurk far down and cling to the very kelson of the ship. It is unmanning to think of the immutable ceremonies and iron etiquette of a man of war, the spiked barriers separating the various grades of rank, the delegated absolutism of authority on all hands, the impossibility on the part of the common seaman of appeal from incidental abuses, and many more things that might be enumerated, all tend to beget in most armed ships a general social condition, which is the precise reverse of what any Christian could desire. And though there are vessels that in some measure furnish exceptions to this, and though in other ships the thing may be glazed over by a guarded, punctilious exterior, almost completely hiding the truth from casual visitors, while the worst facts touching the common sailor are systematically kept in the background, yet it is certain that what has here been said of the domestic interior of a man of war will in a greater or less degree apply to most vessels in the Navy. It is not that the officers are so malevolent, nor altogether that the man of war's man is so vicious. Some of these evils are unavoidably generated through the operation of the Naval Code. Others are absolutely organic to the Navy establishment, and like other organic evils are incurable, except when they dissolve with the body they lie in. Chapter 90. The Manning of Navies. The gallows in the sea refuse nothing, is a very old sea saying, and among all the wondrous prints of Hogarth, there is none remaining more true at the present day than the dramatic boat scene, where after consorting with harlots and gambling on tombstones, the idle apprentice and the villainous low forehead is at last represented as being pushed off to sea, with a ship and a gallows in the distance. But Hogarth should have converted the ship's masts themselves into Tyburn trees, and thus with the ocean for a background closed the career of his hero. It would then have had all the dramatic force of the opera of Don Juan, who, after running his impious courses, is swept from our sight in a tornado of devils. For the sea is the true Tophet and bottomless pit of many workers of iniquity, and as the German mystics feigned Gehennas within Gehennas, even so are men of war familiarly known among sailors as floating hells, and as the sea, according to old Fuller, is the stable of brute monsters, gliding hither and thither in unspeakable swarms, even so is it the home of many moral monsters, who fitly divide its empire with the snake, the shark, and the worm. Nor are sailors and men of war's men especially at all blind to a true sense of these things. Purser rigged and parish damned, is the sailor saying in the American Navy, when the tyro first mounts the lined frock and blue jacket, aptly manufactured for him in a state prison ashore. No wonder that, lured by some crimp into a service so galling and, perhaps, persecuted by a vindictive lieutenant, some repentant sailors have actually jumped into the sea to escape from their fate, or set themselves adrift on the wide ocean on the gratings without compass or rudder. In one case, a young man, after being nearly cut into dog's meat at the gangway, loaded his pockets with shot and walked overboard. Some years ago, I was in a whaling ship lying in a harbor off the Pacific, with 3 French men of war alongside. One dark, moody night, a suppressed cry was heard from the face of the waters, and thinking it was someone drowning, a boat was lowered, when 2 French sailors were picked up, half dead from exhaustion, and nearly throttled by a bundle of their clothes tied fast to their shoulders. In this manner they had attempted their escape from their vessel. When the French officers came in pursuit, these sailors, rallying from their exhaustion, fought like tigers to resist being captured. Though this story concerns a French armed ship, it is not less applicable in degree to those of other nations. Mixed with the men in an American armed ship, mark how many foreigners there are, though it is against the law to enlist them. Nearly 1/3 of the petty officers of the Neversink were born east of the Atlantic. Why is this? Because the same principle that operates in hindering Americans from hiring themselves out as menial domestics also restrains them in a great measure from voluntarily assuming a far worse servitude in the Navy. Sailors wanted for the Navy is a common announcement among the wharves of our seaports. They are always wanted. It may have been in part owing to this scarcity, man-of-war's men, that not many years ago black slaves were frequently to be found regularly enlisted with the crew of an American frigate, their masters receiving their pay. This was in the teeth of a law of Congress expressly prohibiting slaves in the Navy. This law indirectly means black slaves, nothing being said concerning white ones. But in view of what John Randolph of Roanoke said about the frigate that carried him to Russia, and in view of what most armed vessels actually are at present, the American Navy is not altogether an inappropriate place for hereditary bondmen. Still, the circumstance of their being found in it is of such a nature that to some it may hardly appear credible. The incredulity of such persons, nevertheless, must yield to the fact that on board of the United States ship Neversink, during the present cruise, there was a Virginian slave regularly shipped as a seaman, his owner receiving his wages. Guinea, such was his name among the crew, belonged to the purser, who was a southern gentleman, who was employed as his body servant. Never did I feel my condition as a man-of-war's man so keenly as when seeing this Guinea freely circulating about the decks in citizens' clothes, and through the influence of his master, almost entirely exempted from the disciplinary degradation of the Caucasian crew. Faring sumptuously in the wardroom, sleek and round, his ebon face fairly polished with content, ever gay and hilarious, ever ready to laugh and joke, that African slave was actually envied by many of the seamen. There were times when I almost envied him myself. Lemsford once envied him outright. "Ah, Guinea," he laughed, "you have peaceful times. You never open the book I read in." One morning, when all hands were called to witness punishment, the purser's slave, as usual, was observed to be hurrying down the ladders toward the wardroom, his face wearing that peculiar pinched blueness which, in the Negro, answers to the paleness caused by nervous agitation in the white. "Where are you going, Guinea?" cried the deck officer, a humorous gentleman who sometimes diverted himself with the purser's slave, and well knew what answer he would receive from him. "Where are you going, Guinea?" said this officer. "Turn about. Don't you hear the call, sir?" "'Scuse me, massa," said the slave, with a low salutation. "I can't tand it. I can't indeed, massa." And so saying, he disappeared beyond the hatchway. He was the only person on board, except the hospital steward and the invalids of the sick bay, who was exempted from being present at the administering of the scourge. Accustomed to light and easy duties from his birth, and so fortunate as to meet with none but gentle masters, Guinea, though a bondman, liable to be saddled with a mortgage, like a horse, Guinea, in India rubber manacles, enjoyed the liberties of the world. Though his body and soul proprietor, the purser, never in any way individualized me while I served on board the frigate, and never did me a good office of any kind, it was hardly in his power, yet from his pleasant, kind, indulgent manner toward his slave, I always imputed to him a generous heart, and cherished an involuntary friendliness toward him. Upon our arrival home, his treatment of Guinea, under circumstances peculiarly calculated to stir up the resentment of a slave owner, still more augmented my estimation of the purser's good heart. Mention has been made of the number of foreigners in the American Navy, but it is not in the American Navy alone that foreigners bear so large a proportion to the rest of the crew, though in no navy, perhaps, have they ever borne so large a proportion as in our own. According to an English estimate, the foreigners serving in the King's ship at one time amounted to 1/8 of the entire body of seamen. How it is in the French Navy I cannot with certainty say, but I have repeatedly sailed with English seamen who have served in it. One of the effects of the free introduction of foreigners into any navy can be sufficiently deplored. During the period I lived in the Neversink, I was repeatedly struck with the lack of patriotism in many of my shipmates. True, they were mostly foreigners who unblushingly avowed that they were not in it for the difference of pay. They would as lief man the guns of an English ship as those in the American or Frenchman. Nevertheless, it was evident that as for any high-toned patriotic feeling, there was comparatively very little, hardly any of it, evinced by our sailors as a body. Upon reflection, this was not to be wondered at. From their roving career and the sundering of all domestic ties, many sailors all over the world are like the free companions who some centuries ago wandered over Europe, ready to fight the battles of any prince who could purchase their swords. The only patriotism is born and nurtured in a stationary home. and upon an immovable hearthstone. But the man-of-war's man, though in his voyagings he weds the two poles and brings both Indies together, yet let him wander where he will. He carries his one only home along with him. That one home is his hammock. Born under a gun and educated on the bowsprit, according to a phrase of his own, the man-of-war man rolls round the world like a billow, ready to mix with any sea or be sucked down to death in the maelstrom of any war. Yet more, the dread of the general discipline of the man-of-war, the special obnoxiousness of the gangway, the protracted confinement on board ship with so few liberty days, and the pittance of pay, much less than what can always be had in the merchant service, these things contrive to deter from the navies of all countries by far the majority of their best seamen. This will be obvious when the following statistical facts, taken from Macpherson's Annals of Commerce, are considered. At one period upon the peace establishment, the number of men employed in the English Navy was 25,000. At the same time, the English merchant service was employing 118,952. But while the necessities of a merchantman render it indispensable that the greater part of her crew be able seamen, the circumstances of a man-of-war admit of her mustering a crowd of landsmen, soldiers, and boys in her service. By a statement of Captain Marryat in his pamphlet A.D. 1822 on the abolition of impressment, it appears that at the close of the Bonaparte Wars, a full third of all the crews of His Majesty's fleets consisted of landsmen and boys. Far from entering with enthusiasm into the king's ships when their country were menaced, the great body of English seamen, appalled at the discipline of the Navy, adopted unheard-of devices to escape its press gangs. Some even hid themselves in caves and lonely places inland, fearing to run the risk of seeking a berth in an outward-bound merchantman that might have carried them beyond the sea. In the true narrative of John Nichol, mariner, published in 1822 by Blackwood in Edinburgh and Cadell in London, and which everywhere bears the spontaneous impress of truth, the old sailor, in the most artless, touching, and most uncomplaining manner, tells of his skulking like a thief for whole years in the country round about Edinburgh to avoid the press gangs, prowling round the lands like bandits and burghers. At this time, Bonaparte's wars, according to steel lists, there were 45 regular press gang stations in Great Britain. Footnote. Besides this domestic kidnapping, British frigates in friendly or neutral harbors, in some instances, pressed into their service foreign sailors of all nations from the public wharves. In certain cases where Americans were concerned, when protections were found upon their persons, these were destroyed. And to prevent the American consul from claiming his sailor countrymen, the press gang generally went on shore the night previous to the sailing of the frigate, so that the kidnapped seamen were far out to sea before they could be missed by their friends. These things should be known, for in case the English government again goes to war with its fleets, and should again resort to indiscriminate impressment to man them, it is well that both Englishmen and Americans, that all the world be prepared to put down an iniquity outrageous and insulting to God and man. In a later instance, a large body of British seamen solemnly assembled upon the eve of an anticipated war, and together determined that in case of its breaking out they would at once flee to America to avoid being pressed into the service of their country, a service which degraded her own guardians at the gangway. At another time, long previous to this, according to an English Navy officer, Lieutenant Tomlinson, 3,000 seamen, impelled by the same motive, fled ashore in a panic from the colliers between Yarmouth Roads and the Nore. Elsewhere, he says in speaking of some of the men on board the king's ships that they were the most miserable objects. This remark is perfectly corroborated by other testimony referring to another period. In alluding to the lamented scarcity of good English seamen during the wars of 1808, etc., the author of a pamphlet, Navy Subjects, says that all the best seamen, the steadiest and most behaved men, generally succeeded in avoiding the impress. This writer was or had been himself a captain in the British fleet. Now it may be easily imagined who are the men, and of what moral character they are, who, even at present day, are willing to enlist as full-grown adults in a service so galling to all shore manhood as the Navy. Hence it comes that the skulkers and scoundrels of all sorts in a man-of-war are chiefly composed not of regular seamen, but of these dock-lopers, of landsmen, who enter the Navy to draw their grog and murder their time in the notorious idleness of a frigate. But if so idle, why not reduce the number of a man-of-war's crew and reasonably keep employed the rest? It cannot be done. In the first place, the magnitude of most of these ships requires a large number of hands to brace the heavy yards, hoist the enormous topsails, and weigh the ponderous anchor. And though the occasion for the employment of so many men comes but seldom, it is true, yet that when occasion does come, and come it may at any moment, this multitude of men are indispensable. But besides this, and to crown all, the batteries must be manned. There must be men enough to work all the guns at one time, and thus, and in order to have a sufficiency of mortals at hand to sink, burn, and destroy, a man of war through her vices, hopelessly depraving the volunteer landsmen and ordinary seamen of good habits, who occasionally enlist, must feed at the public cost a multitude of persons, who, if they did not find a home in the Navy, they probably would fall on the parish or linger out their days in a prison. Among others, these are the men into whose mouths Dibdin puts his patriotic verses, full of sea chivalry and romance. With an exception in the last line, they might be sung with equal propriety by both English and American men-of-war's men. As for me in all weathers, all times, tides, and ends, naught to trouble from duty that springs. For my heart is my poles, and my rhinos my friends. As for my life, it is the king's. To rancor unknown, to no passion a slave, nor unmanly, nor mean, nor a railer, etc. I do not unite with the high critical authority in considering Dibdin's ditties as slang songs, for most of them breathe the very poetry of the ocean. But it is remarkable that those songs, which would lead one to think that man-of-war's men are the most carefree, contented, virtuous, and patriotic of mankind, were composed at a time when the English Navy was principally manned by felons and paupers, as mentioned in the former chapter. Still more, these songs are pervaded by a true Mohammedan sensualism, a reckless acquiescence in fate, and an implicit, unquestioning, dog-like devotion to whoever may be lord and master. Dibdin was a man of genius, but no wonder Dibdin was a government pensioner at L200 per annum. But notwithstanding the iniquities of a man of war, men are to be found in them, at times, so used to a hard life, so drilled and disciplined to servitude, that, with an incomprehensible philosophy, they seem cheerfully to resign themselves to their fate. They have plenty to eat, spirits to drink, clothing to keep them warm, a hammock to sleep in, tobacco to chew, a doctor to medicine them, a person to pray for them. And to a penniless castaway, must not all these seem as a luxurious bill of fare? There was on board of the Neversinks a foretop man by the name of Landless, who, though his back was crossbarred and plaid with the ineffaceable scars of all the floggings accumulated by a reckless tar during 10 years' service in the Navy, yet he perpetually wore a hilarious face, and at joke and repartee was a very Joe Miller. That man, though a sea vagabond, was not created in vain. He enjoyed life with the zest of everlasting adolescence, and though cribbed in the oaken prison, with the turnkey sentries all round him, yet he paced the gun deck as if it were broad as a prairie, and diversified in landscapes as the hills and valleys of the Tyrol. Nothing ever disconcerted him, nothing could transmute his laugh into anything like a sigh. Those glandular secretions, which in other caps sometimes go through the formations of tears, in him were expectorated from the mouth, tinged with the golden juice of a weed, wherewith he solaced and comforted his ignominious days. Rum and tobacco, said Landless, what more does a sailor want? His favorite song was Dibdin's True English Sailor, beginning, Jack dances and sings and is always content, and in his vows to his lass he'll ne'er fail her. His anchor's a trip when his money's all spent, and this is the life of a sailor. But poor Landless danced quite as often at the gangway under the lash as in the sailor dance houses ashore. Another of his songs, also set to the significant tune of the King, God bless him, mustered the following lines among many similar ones. Oh, when safely landed in Boston or York, oh how I tipple and jig it, and toss off my glass while my rhino holds out, and drinking success to our frigate. During the many idle hours when our frigate was lying in harbor, this man was either merrily playing at checkers or mending his clothes, or snoring like a trumpeter under the lee of the booms. When fast asleep, a national salute from our batteries could hardly move him. Whether ordered to the main truck in a gale, or rolled by the drum to the grog tub, or commanded to walk up to the gratings and be lashed, Landless always obeyed with the same invincible indifference. His advice to a young lad who shipped with us at Valparaiso embodies the pith and marrow of that philosophy which enables some man-of-war's men to wax jolly in the service. Shippy, said Landless, taking the pale lad by his neckerchief, as if he had him by the halter. Shippy, I've seen sarvice with Uncle Sam, and I've sailed with many Andrew Millers. Now take my advice and steer clear of all trouble. D'ye see? Touch your tile whenever a swab, officer, speaks to you. And never mind how much they ropes into you. Keep your red rag belayed, For you must know as how they don't fancy sea lawyers, and when the starving out of slops comes round, stand up to it stiffly. It's only an "oh Lord" or two, and a few "oh my gods," that's all. And what then? Why, you sleeps it off a few nights and turn out all at last ready for your grog. This Landless was a favorite with the officers, among whom he went by the name of Happy Jack, and it is just such Happy Jacks as Landless that was most sea officers profess to admire. A fellow without shame, without a soul, so dead to the least dignity of manhood that he could hardly be called a man. Whereas a seaman who exhibits traits of moral sensitiveness, whose demeanor shows some dignity within, this is the man they, in many cases, instinctively dislike. The reason is they feel such a man to be a continual reproach to them, as being mentally superior to their power. He has no business in a man of war. They do not want such men. To them, there is an insolence in his manly freedom, contempt in his very carriage. He is unendurable, as an erect, lofty-minded African would be to some slave-driving planter. Let it not be supposed, however, that the marks in this and the preceding chapter apply to all men of war. There are some vessels blessed with patriarchal intellectual captains, gentlemanly and brotherly officers, and docile and Christianized crews. The peculiar usages of such vessels insensibly softens the tyrannical rigor of the articles of war. In them, scourging is unknown. To sail in such ships is hardly to realize that you live under the martial law, or that the evils above mentioned can anywhere exist. And Jack Chase, Old Ushant, and several more fine tars that might be added sufficiently attest that in the Neversink at least there was more than one noble man of war's man who almost redeemed all the rest. Wherever throughout this narrative the American Navy in any of its bearings is formed the theme of a general discussion, hardly one syllable of admiration for what is accounted illustrious in its achievements has been permitted to escape me. The reason is this: I consider that so far as what is called military renown is concerned, the American Navy needs no eulogist but history. It were superfluous for Whitejacket to tell the world what it knows already. The office imposed upon me is of another cast, and though I foresee and feel that it may subject me to the pillory in the hard thoughts of some men, yet supported by what God has given me, I tranquilly abide the event whatever it may prove. Chapter 91. Smoking Club in a Man of War, with scenes on the gun deck drawing near home. There is a fable about a painter moved by Jove to the painting of the head of Medusa. Though the picture was true to the life, yet the poor artist sickened at the sight of what his forced pencil had drawn. Thus borne through my task toward the end, my own soul now sinks at what I myself have portrayed. But let us forget past chapters, if we may, while we paint these less repugnant things. Metropolitan gentlemen have their club, provincial gossipers their newsroom, village quidnuncs their barber shop, the Chinese their opium houses, American Indians their console fire, and even cannibals their nunjuna, or talkstone, where they assemble at times to discuss the affairs of the day. Nor is there any government, however despotic, that ventures to deny to the least of its subjects the privilege of a sociable chat. Not the 30 tyrants, even the club post-captains of old Athens, could stop the wagging tongues at the street corners, for chat man must, and by our immortal Bill of Rights that guarantees us liberty of speech, chat we Yankees will, and whether on board a frigate or on board our own terra firma plantations. In men of war, the galley or cookery on the gun deck is the grand center of gossip and news among the sailors. Here crowds assemble to chat away the half-hour elapsing at every meal. The reason why this place and these hours are selected rather than others is this: in the neighborhood of the galley alone, and only after meals, is the man of war's man permitted to regale himself with a smoke. A sumptuary edict, truly, that deprived Whitejacket for one of a luxury to which he had long been attached. For how can the mystical motives, the capricious impulses of a luxurious smoker go and come at the beck of a commodore's command? No, when I smoke, be it because of my sovereign good pleasure. I choose so to do, though at so unseasonable an hour that I send round the town for a brazier of coals. What? Smoke by a sundial, smoke on compulsion. Make a trade, a business, a vile recurring calling of smoking. And perhaps when those sedative fumes have steeped you in the grandest of reveries, and circle over circle, solemnly rises some immeasurable dome in your soul, far away, swelling and heaving into the vapor you raise, as if from one Mozart's grand marches of a temple were rising, like Venus from the sea. At such a time, to have your whole Parthenon tumbled about your ears by the knell of the ship's bell, announcing the expiration of the half hour for smoking. Whip me, ye Furies, toast me in saltpeter, smite me, some thunderbolt, charge upon me endless squadrons of Mamelukes, devour me, Fijis, but preserve from me a tyranny like this. No, though I smoked like an Indian summer ere I entered the Neversink, so abhorrent was this sumptuary law that I altogether abandoned the luxury, rather than enslave it to a time and a place. Herein did I not write ancient and honorable old guard of smokers around the world? But there were others of the crew not so fastidious as myself. After every meal they hied to the galley and solaced their souls with a whiff. Now a bunch of cigars, all blanded together, is a type and a symbol of the brotherly love between smokers. Likewise, for the time, in a community of pipes is a community of hearts. Nor was it an ill thing for the Indian Sachems to circulate their calumet tobacco bowl, even as our own forefathers circulated their punch bowl, in token of peace, charity, and goodwill, friendly feelings, and sympathizing souls. And this it was that made the gossipers of the galley so loving a club, so long as the vapory bond united them. It was a pleasant sight to behold them, grouped in the recesses between the guns. They chatted and laughed like rows of convivialists in the boxes of some vast dining saloon. Take a Flemish kitchen full of good fellows from Teniers, add a fireside group from Wilkie, throw in a naval sketch from the Cruikshank, and then stick a short pipe into every mother's son's mouth, and you have the smoking scene at the galley of the Neversink. Not a few were politicians, and as there were some thoughts of a war with England at the time, their discussions waxed warm. "I tell you what it is, shippies," cried the old captain of gun number 1 on the forecastle, "if that 'ere president of ourn don't luff up into the wind by the Battle of the Nile, he'll be getting us into a grand fleet engagement afore the Yankee nation has rammed home her cartridges, let alone blowing the match." "Who talks of luffing?" roared a roistering foretop man. "Keep our Yankee nation large before the wind, say I, till you come plump on the enemy's bows, and then board him in the smoke." And with that there came forth a mighty blast from his pipe. "Who says the old man at the helm of the Yankee nation can't steer his trick as well as George Washington himself?" cried a sheet anchor man. "But they say he's a cold water customer, Bill," cried another, "and sometimes a nights I somehow has a presentation that he's going to stop our grog." "Do you hear there, fore and aft?" roared the boatswain's mate at the gangway. "All hands tumble up and about ship." "That's the talk," cried the captain of gun 1, as in obedience to the summons, all hands dropped their pipes and crowded towards the ladders. "And that's what the president must do. Go in stays, my lads, and put the Yankee nation on the other tack." But these political discussions by no means supplied the staple of the conversation for the gossiping smokers of the galley. The interior affairs of the frigate itself formed their principal theme. Rumors about the private life of the Commodore and his captain, about the captain and his, about the various officers in the wardroom, about the reefers in the steerage and their madcap frolickings, and about 1,000 other matters touching the crew themselves. All these, forming the eternally shifting domestic byplay of a man of war, proved inexhaustible topics for our quidnuncs. The animation of these scenes was very much heightened as we drew nearer and nearer our port. It rose to a climax when the frigate was reported to be only 24 hours' sail from the land. What they should do when they landed, how they should invest their wages, what they should eat, what they should drink, and what last they should marry. These were the topics which absorbed them. "Sink the sea," cried a forecastle man. "Once more ashore and you'll never catch again. Old boom boat afloat. I mean to settle down in a sail loft." "Cable tier, pinchers, blister all tarpaulin hats," cried a young afterguards man. "I mean to go back to the counter." "Shipmates, take me by the arms and swab up the lee scuppers with me. But I mean to steer a clam cart before I go again to a ship's wheel. Let the navy go by the board. To sea again I won't." "Start my soul boats, mateys. If any more Blue Peters and sailing signals fly at my fore," cried the captain of the head, "my wages will buy a wheelbarrow, if nothing more." "I've taken my last dose of salts," said the captain of the waist, "and after this mean to stick to fresh water. Aye, mateys, 10 of us wasters meant to club together and buy a serving mallet boat, d'ye see? And if we ever drown, it'll be in the raging canal. Blast the sea, shipmates, say I." "Profane, not the holy element," said Lemsford, the poet of the gun deck, leaning over a cannon. "Know you not, man of war's men, that by the Parthian Magi the ocean was held sacred? Did not Tiridates, the Eastern monarch, take an immense land circuit to avoid desecrating the Mediterranean in order to reach his imperial master, Nero, and do homage for his crown?" "What lingo is that?" cried the captain of the West. "Who's Commodore Tittery-eye?" cried the forecastle man. "Hear me out," resumed Lemsford. Like Tiridates, I venerate the sea, and venerate it so highly, shipmates, that evermore I shall abstain from crossing it. In that sense, Captain of the Waste, I echo your cry. It was indeed a remarkable fact that 9 men out of every 10 of the Neversink's crew had formed some plan or other to keep themselves ashore for life, or at least on fresh water, after the expiration of the present cruise. With all the experiences of that cruise accumulated in one intense recollection of a moment, with the smell of tar in their nostrils, out of sight of land, with a stout ship underfoot, and snuffling the ocean air, with all the things of the sea surrounding them in their cool, sober moments of reflection, in the silence and solitude of the deep, during the long night watches when all their holy home associations were thronging around their hearts, in the spontaneous piety and devotion of the last hours of so long a voyage, in the fullness and the frankness of their souls, when there was naught to the jar but well-poised equilibrium of their judgment. Under all these circumstances, at least 9/10 of a crew of 500 man-of-war's men resolve forever to turn their backs on the sea. But do men ever hate the thing they love? Do men forswear the hearth and the homestead? What then must the navy be? But alas for the man-of-war's man who, though he may take a Hannibal oath against the service, yet cruise after cruise, and after forswearing it again and again, he is driven back to the spirit tub and the gun deck by his old hereditary foe, the ever-devilish god of grog. On this point, let some of the crew of the Nethersink be called to the stand. You, captain of the waist, and you, seaman of the foretop, and you, afterguardsmen and others, how came you here at the guns of the North Carolina after registering your solemn vows at the galley of the Neversink? They all hang their heads. I know the cause, poor fellows. Perjure yourselves not again. Swear not at all hereafter. Aye, these very tars, the foremost in denouncing the navy, who had bound themselves by the most tremendous oaths, these very men, not 3 days after getting ashore, were rolling round in the streets, penniless, drunk. And next day many of them were to be found on board of the Gardo or receiving ship. Thus, in part, is the navy manned. But what was still more surprising and tended to impart a new and strange insight into the characters of sailors and overthrow some long-established ideas concerning them as a class was this. Numbers of men who during the cruise had passed for exceedingly prudent, nay, parsimonious persons, who would even refuse you a patch or a needleful of thread, and from their stinginess procured the name of ravelings. No sooner were these men fairly adrift in harbor and under the influence of frequent quaffings than their 3 years' earned wages flew right and left. They summoned whole boarding houses of sailors to the bar and treated them over and over again. Fine fellows, generous-hearted tars. Seeing this sight, I thought to myself, well, these generous-hearted tars on shore were the greatest curmudgeons afloat. It's the bottle that's generous, not they. Yet the popular conceit concerning a sailor is derived from his behavior ashore, whereas ashore he is no longer a sailor, but a landsman for the time. A man-of-war's man is only a man-of-war's man at sea, and the sea is the place to learn what he is. But we have seen that a man-of-war's man is but the old-fashioned world of ours afloat, full of all manners of characters, full of strange contradictions. And though boasting some fine fellows here and there, yet upon the whole charged to the combings of her hatchways with the spirit of Belial and all unrighteousness. Chapter 92, The Last of the Jacket. Already has White Jacket chronicled the mishaps and inconveniences, troubles and tribulations of all sorts brought upon him by that unfortunate but indispensable garment of his, but now it befalls him to record how this jacket, for the second and last time, came near proving his shroud. Of a pleasant midnight, our good frigate, now somewhere off the capes of Virginia, was running on bravely when the breeze, gradually dying, left us slowly gliding toward our still invisible port. Headed by Jack Chase, the close quarter watch were reclining in the top, talking about the shore delights into which they intended to plunge, while our captain often broke in with allusions to similar conversations when he was on board the English line of battleship, the Asia, drawing nigh to Portsmouth in England after the Battle of Navarino. Suddenly an order was given to set the main top gallant stunsail, and the halyards not being rove, Jack Chase assigned me to that duty. Now this reeving of the halyards of the main top gallant stunsail is a business that eminently demands sharp-sightedness, skill, and celerity. Consider that the end of a line, some 200 feet long, is to be carried aloft in your teeth, if you please, and dragged far out on the giddiest of yards, and after being wormed and twisted about through all sorts of intricacies, turning abrupt corners, at the abruptest of angles, is to be dropped, clear of all obstructions, in a straight plumb line right down to the deck, In the course of this business, there is a multitude of sheave holes and blocks through which you must pass it. Often the rope is a very tight fit, so as to make it like threading a fine cambric needle with rather coarse thread. Indeed, it is only a thing deftly to be done even by day. Judge then what it must be to be threading cambric needles by night and at sea upward 100 feet aloft in the air. With the end of the line in one hand, I was mounting the topmast shrouds when our captain of the top told me that I had better off jacket. But though it was not a very cold night, I had been reclining so long in the top that I had become somewhat chilly, so I thought best not to comply with the hint. Having reeved the line through all the inferior blocks, I went out with it to the end of the weather topgallant yardarm, and was in the act of leaning over and passing it through the suspended jewel block there, when the ship gave a plunge in the sudden swells of the calm sea, and pitching me still further over the yard, threw the heavy skirts of my jacket right over my head, completely muffling me. Somehow, I thought it was the sail that had flapped, and under that impression threw up my hands to drag it from my head, relying upon the sail itself to support me meanwhile. Just then the ship gave another sudden jerk, and head foremost I pitched from the yard. I knew where I was from the rush of the air by my ears, but all else was a nightmare. A bloody film was before my eyes, through which, ghost-like, passed and repassed my father, mother, and sisters. An unutterable nausea oppressed me. I was conscious of gasping. There seemed no breath in my body. It was over 100 feet that I fell down, with lungs collapsed as in death. 10,000 pounds a shot seemed tied to my head, as the irresistible law of gravitation dragged me, head foremost and straight as a die, toward the infallible center of this terraqueous globe. All I had seen and read and heard, and all I had thought and felt in my life seemed intensified in one fixed idea in my soul, but dense as this idea was, it was made up of atoms, having fallen from the projecting yardarm end. I was conscious of a collected satisfaction and feeling that I should not be dashed on the deck, but would sink into the speechless profound of the sea. With the bloody blind film before my eyes, there was a still stranger hum in my head, as if a hornet were there, and I thought to myself, great God, this is death. Yet these thoughts were unmixed with alarm. Like frostwork that flashes and shifts its scared hues in the sun, all my braided, blended emotions were in themselves icy cold and calm. So protracted did my fall seem that I can even now recall the feeling of wondering how much longer it would be ere all was over and I struck. Time seemed to stand still, and all the worlds seemed poised on their poles as I fell, soul becalmed, through the eddying whirl and swirl of the maelstrom air. At first, as I have said, I must have been precipitated head foremost, but I was conscious at length of a swift, flinging motion of my limbs, which involuntarily threw themselves out, so that at last I must have fallen in a heap. This is more likely from the circumstance that when I struck the sea, I felt as if someone had smote me slantingly across the shoulder and along part of my right side. As I gushed into the sea, a thunderboom sounded in my ear. My soul seemed flying from my mouth. The feeling of death flooded over me with the billows. The blow from the sea must have turned me so that I sank almost feet foremost through a soft, seething, foamy lull. Some current seemed hurrying me away. In a trance I yielded and sank deeper down with a glide. Purple and pathless was the deep calm now around me, flecked by summer lightnings and an azure far. The horrible nausea was gone. The bloody, blind film turned a pale green. I wondered whether I was yet dead or still dying. But of a sudden some fashionless form brushed my side, some inert coiled fish of the sea. The thrill of being alive again tingled in my nerves, and the strong shunning of death shocked me through. For one instant, an agonizing revulsion came over me as I found myself utterly sinking. Next moment the force of my fall was expanded, and there I hung, vibrating in the mid-deep. What wild sounds then rang in my ear! One was a soft moaning as of low waves on the beach, the other wild and heartlessly jubilant, as of the sea in a height of a tempest. O soul, thou then heardest life and death, as he who stands upon the Corinthian shore hears both the Ionian and the Aegean waves. The life and death poise soon passed, and then I found myself slowly ascending and caught a dim glimmering of light. Quicker and quicker I mounted, till at last I bounded up like a buoy, and my whole head was bathed in the blessed air. I had fallen in a line with the main mast. I now found myself nearly abreast of the mizzen-mast, the frigate slowly gliding by like a black world in the water. Her vast hull loomed out of the night, showing hundreds of seamen in the hammock nettings, some tossing over ropes, others madly flinging overboard the hammocks. but I was too far out from them immediately to reach what they threw. I essayed to swim toward the ship, but instantly I was conscious of a feeling like being pinioned in a feather bed, and moving my hands felt my jacket puffed out above my tight girdle with water. I strove to tear it off, but it was looped together here and there, and the strings were not then to be sundered by hand. I whipped out my knife that was tucked at my belt and ripped my jacket straight up and down, as if I were ripping open myself. With a violent struggle, I then burst out of it and was free. Heavily soaked, it slowly sank before my eyes. Sink, sink, O shroud, thought I, sink forever, accursed jacket that thou art. See that white shark, cried a horrified voice from the taffrail. He'll have that man down his hatchway. Quick, the grains, the grains! The next instant, that barbed bunch of harpoons pierced through and through the unfortunate jacket, and swiftly sped down with it, out of sight. Being now astern of the frigate, I struck out boldly toward the elevated pole of one of the life buoys which had been cut away. Soon after, one of the cutters picked me up as they dragged me out of the water into the air. The sudden transition of elements made my every limb feel like lead, and I helplessly sunk into the bottom of the boat. 10 minutes after, I was safe on board, and springing aloft, was ordered to reeve anew the stunsail halyards, which, slipping through the blocks, when I had let go to the end, had unrove and fallen to the deck. The sail was soon set, and, as if purposely to salute it, a gentle breeze soon came, and the Neversink once more glided over the water, a soft ripple at her bows, and leaving a tranquil wake behind. Chapter 93. Cable and anchor all clear. And now that the white jacket has sunk to the bottom of the sea, and the blessed capes of Virginia are believed to be broad on our bow, though still out of sight, our 500 souls are fondly dreaming of home, and the iron throats of the guns round the galley re-echo with their songs and hurrahs. What more remains? Shall I tell what conflicting and almost crazy surmisings prevailed concerning the precise harbor for which we were bound? For according to rumor, our Commodore had received sealed orders touching that matter, which were not to be broken until we gained a precise latitude of the coast. Shall I tell how, at last, all this uncertainty departed, and many a foolish prophecy was proved false, when our noble frigate, her longest pennant at her main, wound her stately way into the innermost harbor of Norfolk, like a plumed Spanish grandee threading the corridors of the Escurial toward the throne room within? Shall I tell how we kneeled upon the holy soil, how I begged a blessing of old Ashant and one precious hair of his beard for a keepsake? How Lemsford, the gun-deck bard, offered up a devout ode as a prayer of thanksgiving? How Saturnine Nord, the Magnifico in disguise, refusing all companionship, stalked off into the woods like the ghost of an old caliph of Baghdad? How I swayed and swung the hardy hand of Jack Chase and nipped it to mine with a Carrick bend? Yeah, and kissed that noble hand of my liege and lord of my top, my sea tutor and sire? Shall I tell how the Grand Commodore and Captain drove off from the pier head? How the lieutenants in undress sat down to their last dinner in the wardroom, and the champagne packed in ice, spirited and sparkled like the hot springs of a snowdrift in Iceland? How the chaplain went off in his cassock without bidding the people adieu? How Shrunken Cuticle, the surgeon, stalked over the side, the wired skeleton carried in the wake of his cot boy? How the lieutenant, a marine, sheathed his swords on the poop, and, calling for wax and taper, sealed the end of the scabbard with his family crest and motto, Denique Colem? How the purser in due time mustered his money bags and paid us all off on the quarterdeck, good and bad, sick and well, all receiving their wages, though, truth to tell, some reckless and provident seamen who had lived too fast during the cruise had little or nothing now standing on the credit side of their purser's accounts? Shall I tell of the retreat of the 500 inland, not alas, in battle array as at quarters, but scattered broadcast over the land? Shall I tell how the Neversink was at last stripped of spars, shrouds, and sails, had her guns hoisted out, her powder magazines, shot lockers, and armories discharged, till not one vestige of fighting was left in her from furthest stem to uttermost stern? No, let all this go by, for our anchor still hangs from our bows, though its eager flukes dip their points in the impatient waves. Let us leave the ship on the sea, still with the land out of sight, still with brooding darkness on the face of the deep. I love an indefinite, infinite background, a vast, heaving, rolling, mysterious rear. It is night, the meager moon is in her last quarter, that betokens the end of a cruise that is passing, but the stars look forth in their everlasting brightness. And that is the everlasting, glorious future forever beyond us. We main-top men, We are all aloft in the top, and round our mast we circle, a brother band, hand in hand, all spliced together. We have reefed the last topsail, trained the last gun, blown the last match, bowed to the last blast, been tranced in the last calm. We have mustered our last round the capstan, been rolled to grog the last time, for the last time swung in our hammocks, for the last time turned out at the seagull call of the watch. We have seen our last man scourged at the gangway, our last man gasp out at the ghost of the stifling sick bay, our last man tossed to the sharks. Our last death-denouncing article of war has been read, and far inland, in that blessed clime whitherward our frigate now glides, the last wrong in our frigate will be remembered no more. When down from our main mast comes our Commodore's pennant, when down sinks its shooting stars from the sky, by the mark 9 sings the hoary old leadsman in the chains, and thus the mid-world equator past, our frigate strikes soundings at last. Hand in hand we topmates stand, rocked in our pisgah top, and over the starry waves, and broad out into the blandly blue and boundless night, spiced with strange sweets from the long-sought land, the whole long cruise predestinated ours, though often in tempest time we almost refuse to believe in that far-distant shore. Straight out into that fragrant night, ever-noble Jack Chase, matchless and unmatchable Jack Chase, stretches forth his bannered hand, and pointing shoreward cries, "For the last time, here Hermann's boys!" How calms the waves, how mild the balmy gale, and halcyons call. Ye Lucians, spread the sail, appeased old ocean, now shall rage no more. Haste, point our bowsprit for yon shadowy shore. Soon shall the transports of your natal soil o'erwhelm in bounding joy the thoughts of every toil. The end. As a man of war that sails through the sea, so this earth that sails through the air, we mortals are all on board a fast-sailing, never-sinking world frigate, of which God has the shipwright, and she is but one craft in a Milky Way fleet, of which God is the Lord High Admiral. The port we sail from is forever astern, and though far out of sight of land, for ages and ages we continue to sail with sealed orders, and our last destination remains a secret to ourselves and our officers. Yet our final haven was predestinated ere we slipped from the stocks at creation. Thus sailing with sealed orders, we ourselves are the repositories of the secret packet, whose mysterious contents we long to learn. There are no mysteries out of ourselves, but let us not give ear to the superstitious gun-deck gossip about whither we may be gliding, for as yet not a soul on board of us knows. Not even the Commodore himself, assuredly not the chaplain. Even our professor's scientific surmisings are vain. On that point, the smallest cabin boy is as wise as the captain, and believe not the hypochondriac dwellers below hatches, who will tell you with a sneer that our world frigate is bound to no final harbor whatever, that our voyage will prove an endless circumnavigation of space. Not so, for how can this world frigate prove our eventual abiding place, when upon our first embarkation as infants in arms, her violent rolling in afterlife unperceived makes every soul of us seasick? Does not this show too that the very air we here inhale is uncongenial, and only becomes endurable at last through gradual habituation, and that some blessed placid haven, however remote at present, must be in store for us all? Glance fore and aft our flush decks. What a swarming crew! All told, they muster hard upon 800 millions of souls. Over these we have a thord of lieutenants, a sword-belted officer of marines, a chaplain, a professor, a purser, a doctor, a cook, a master-at-arms. Oppressed by illiberal laws, and partly oppressed by themselves, many of our people are wicked, unhappy, inefficient. We have skulkers and idlers all round, and brow-beaten wasters who, for a pittance, do our craft's shabby work. Nevertheless, among our people we have gallant fore, main and mizzen topmen aloft, who, well treated or ill, still trim our craft to the blast. We have a brig for trespassers, a bar by our main mast, at which they are arraigned, a cat-o'-nine-tails and a gangway to degrade them in their own eyes and in ours. These are not always employed to convert sin to virtue, but to divide them and protect virtue and legalized sin from unlegalized vice. We have a sick bay for the smitten and helpless, whither we hurry them out of sight, and however they may groan beneath hatches, we hear little of their tribulations on deck. We still sport our gay streamer aloft. Outwardly regarded, our craft is a lie, for all that is outwardly seen of it is the clean-swept deck and off-painted planks comprised above the waterline. whereas the vast mass of our fabric, with all its storerooms of secrets, forever slides along far under the surface. When a shipmate dies, straightway we sew him up, and overboard he goes. Our world frigid rushes by, and never more do we behold him again, though, sooner or later, the everlasting undertow sweeps him toward our own destination. We have both a quarterdeck to our craft and a gun deck, subterranean shot lockers and gunpowder magazines, and the articles of war form our domineering code. Oh, shipmates and worldmates all round, we the people suffer many abuses. Our gun deck is full of complaints. In vain from lieutenants do we appeal to the captain. In vain while on board our world frigate to the indefinite navy commissioners so far out of sight aloft. Yet, the worst of our evils we blindly inflict upon ourselves. Our officers cannot remove them even if they would. From the last ills no being can save another. Therein each man must be his own savior. For the rest, whatever befalls us, let us never train our murderous guns inboard. Let us not mutiny with bloody pikes in our hands. Our high Lord Admiral will yet interpose. And though long ages should elapse and leave our wrongs unredressed, yet, shipmates and worldmates, let us never forget that, whoever afflict us, whatever surround, life is a voyage that's homeward bound. The end.